The quirt came down across the stallion's face before a single man in that yard could move. The horse screamed and slammed backward into the rail, and Nathan Granger lowered his arm like a man who had just brushed dust off a coat sleeve. $12, he said, loud enough for the whole trading post to hear. That's what a killer horse is worth, and I'm being generous. Same as I was generous when I bought your father's note off the bank 3 weeks ago and didn't come collect it the day he was put in the ground. He looked at Luke Callahan and smiled with his teeth. Sign the ranch over by sundown, boy, or I'll take it and the horse both, and you can explain to your brother why he's sleeping in a wagon. Nobody breathed. Then a carriage came through the gate, and a woman's voice said, calm as still water. "50 is your price, Mr. Callahan? I'll pay double, if the cowboy comes with him." If a story like this one keeps you in your chair, do me a kindness. Press that like button, and tell me in the comments what city and what country you're watching from, because I'd truly love to see how far this story travels tonight. Follow along and stay with me to the very end. What happened after that woman opened her mouth is nothing like what any man standing in that yard expected. The morning it all started, Luke Callahan was on the roof of a barn that no longer belonged to him, nailing down a shingle that would not matter by supper. He knew it wouldn't matter. He nailed it anyway. "You're wasting nails," Amos Teague called up from the ground. Amos was 61 years old and had worked that ground since before Luke was born, back when Dan Callahan was still young enough to laugh at debt. "Nails cost money, and money's the one crop we didn't get this year. Roof leaks over the feed. There isn't any feed." Luke drove the nail flat and sat back on his heels. Down in the yard, the dust lay on everything like a gray skin, and the creek that used to run wide enough to swim a horse in was a dark line of mud with cracks running away from it in every direction. 11 months without rain, worth the name. He'd watched the grass go from green to yellow to nothing, watched his father's cattle sell at 40 cents on the dollar because everyone in the territory was selling at once, watched his father stop eating and start sitting on the porch at night with his hat in his hands. "You going into town?" Amos said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "With the horse?" "With the horse," Amos spit into the dust. "Your daddy'd rise up out of the ground." "My daddy," Luke said, coming down the ladder, "is the reason I've got to." He didn't mean it the way it came out. That was the trouble with Luke Callahan, 28 years old, and he'd never once in his life found the soft way to say a hard thing. He'd inherited that from his father, the same way he'd inherited the mortgage. Amos let it lie. He was good at that. The notice was still nailed to the doorframe of the house. Luke had read it 11 times and could recite it, and every time he walked past it, he read it again, like maybe on the 12th reading it would say something different. Notice of demand. $460 and no cents. Tender in full before the 15th day. Today was the 15th day. His brother was sitting on the step under it, whittling nothing out of a stick. "You're taking Blaze," Toby said. "Yeah." "To sell." "Yeah." Toby was 14 and built like a fence post and had their mother's eyes, which was a hard thing to look at some mornings. He didn't stop whittling. Pa said never sell that horse. He said it right in this yard. He said, "That horse is the last good thing we made here, and you don't sell the last good thing." Pa said a lot of things. He meant that one. Luke crouched down so he wasn't standing over him. "Toby, listen to me. $50 won't clear the note. It'll get us 30 days. 30 days, I can drive the north herd to Hollis and sell what's left. And maybe. Toby's knife slipped and took a piece out of his thumb. He didn't flinch. He just looked at the blood and said, "You promised him." "I promised him I'd keep you fed and keep you in this house," Luke said. "Those two things fight each other now, so I'm picking the one I can still win." He stood up. Toby didn't look at him. "You can come to town," Luke said. "No." "Toby, I don't want to watch it." So Luke went alone, and he told himself the whole 4 miles that a boy of 14 doesn't get a vote, and he didn't believe himself for a single step of it. Blaze was a bay stallion, 5 years old, 16 hands, with a white slash down his face that ran crooked at the bottom like a lightning strike that had changed its mind. Dan Callahan had bred him out of a mare he'd taken in trade for a season's work, and he'd stood in the corral the day the colt got up on his legs and said, "That one's going to be worth something to somebody." He'd been right. He'd just been wrong about who. The horse walked beside Luke the way a dog walks beside a man. That was the thing about him, and it was the thing nobody in Prosper Bend would ever believe. Blaze had never been broken. He'd been asked. Dan Callahan didn't hold with breaking, and he'd taught his son the same, and the whole county thought them both fools for it, and the whole county said so out loud and often. Luke stopped at the bank first because he was still fool enough to hope. Harlan Voss had an office with a green shade on the lamp and a picture of his wife on the desk, turned so that visitors could see it. He was a soft-handed man who had never once in his life had to decide between paying a doctor and paying a note. "I can bring you 50 by tonight," Luke said. "Cash, against the interest." Voss made a small, unhappy sound. "Mr. Callahan, I'm going to say something, and I'd take it kindly if you didn't make me say it twice." He folded his hands. "The Cattlemen's Trust no longer holds your father's note." The room got very quiet. Out on the street, a wagon went by. "Say that again." "It was purchased, assigned in full, principal and arrears, on the 22nd of last month." "Purchased by who?" "That's not information I'm at liberty to." Luke put both hands flat on the desk. He didn't shout. He'd learned from his father that a man who shouts has already lost the room. "My father borrowed that money from you," he said. "He shook your hand in this office. He hauled your lumber for 2 summers when you were building this bank, and he charged you under rate because you asked him to, and you sold his paper to a stranger and didn't send word. There is no legal requirement to send word." "That's not what I asked you." Voss's eyes went to the door and came back. "The purchaser paid full face value, in gold. That is not a thing a small bank refuses in a drought year." He straightened the picture of his wife 1/8 of an inch. "I'll tell you this much, and then you'll leave. The gentleman was not from Prosper Bend. He represents a large concern out of the valley, and he asked a great many questions about your acreage, specifically about the section your creek runs through." "There's no water in that creek." "There's a water right in that creek," Voss said, "which is a different animal entirely and lasts a good deal longer than water." Luke stood there a moment. "Good day, Mr. Callahan," Voss said. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a decent man." "He was," Luke said. "That's why you could do it to him." The trading post at Prosper Bend was a corral, a scale house, a long open shed, and about 200 people on a sale morning, half of them there to buy and half there to watch. By the time Luke got Blaze into the corral, the shed was full. The first man to try him was Cyrus Pell, who ran hogs south of town and had never sat anything with more spirit than a plow mule. "He don't look like $50, Pell said. "Sit him and see." Pell got up. Blaze stood like a church. Pell grinned around at the crowd, dug in his heels, and hauled the reins the way a man hauls a stuck door. Blaze came off the ground with all 4 feet and put Cyrus Pell in the dirt so fast the crowd didn't have time to laugh until he'd already landed. They laughed then, loud. Pell got up spitting. "That animal's crazy." "He isn't crazy. He doesn't like his mouth pulled." "A horse takes what he's given?" "Not that one," Luke said. "Then he ain't broke, and you're selling green stock as gentled, and that's the same as lying." Pell slapped dust off his hat and looked around for support and found plenty of it. $18, and only because I'd feel bad leaving him with you. 50. 18. "Then walk," Luke said, and it cost him more than any man there could see. The second man was a trader named Dunlap out of Cheyenne, a lean fellow with a long coat and a wagon full of tack, and a reputation Luke had heard about twice and disliked both times. Dunlap didn't try to ride him. Dunlap walked around him 3 times, looked at his teeth without asking, and said, "He'll do." "For what?" "Exhibition. I run a wild horse show through 4 territories. Folks pay a dime to watch a man get thrown." He smiled. "He'll throw them beautiful. I'd cut him first, of course. Settles the temper." "He's not cut." "He will be by Thursday." "Then no." Dunlap blinked. "I'm offering you $45. I said no." "Son," Dunlap leaned on the rail, "you've got the look of a man with a note due. I've seen 100 of you. Take the 45. And here was the thing that Luke Callahan would think about for years afterward, lying awake in a much finer bed than the one he had then. He almost took it. $45 was $45, and Toby's supper wasn't a principle, it was a plate. He opened his mouth and the word fine was most of the way out of it. And Blaze put his head over Luke's shoulder, the way he'd done every day since he was a colt, and breathed against his neck. "No," Luke said. Dunlap shrugged and went to look at mules, and a man in the crowd said, plenty loud, That's Dan Callahan's boy. Same stubborn streak. Look how that turned out for the daddy. Luke heard it. He turned around and found the man's face and held it until the man found something else to look at. Then the crowd went quiet in a different way, and Luke knew before he turned back what it meant. That particular hush belongs to money arriving. Nathan Granger rode in with two men behind him, and he did not dismount right away, which was its own kind of speech. He was about 45, clean-shaven in a country where nobody was, wearing a coat that had never been rained on. He had the face of a man people trusted on first meeting and kept trusting long after they shouldn't, and he had been Eleanor Kensington's chief administrator for 11 years, which meant that in 3 counties his signature was as good as her word. He looked at the crowd, and then at the horse, and then, last, at Luke. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I don't know you." "You know my paper." Granger swung down. He took a folded document out of his coat and held it up, not to Luke, but to the crowd, turning slowly so everyone got a look. "Assignment of note, executed the 22nd, Cattlemen's Trust of Prosper Bend to Granger Land and Livestock. $460 due on demand, and this—" He made a small show of consulting the paper, though Luke would have bet the ranch he already knew, "is the 15th. The crowd made a low sound. Half of those people owed money to somebody. "You bought my father's note." "I bought a debt," Granger said pleasantly. "Debts are property. Property gets bought. If you object to the principle, you shouldn't have borrowed." "He borrowed it for a well." "He borrowed it for a well he didn't dig deep enough. That's not the bank's failing, and it isn't mine." Granger folded the paper away. "Now, I'm not an unreasonable man, and I don't like doing this in front of people any more than you like having it done." He said that with such convincing regret that Luke almost believed it, and it would be some months before Luke understood that Granger had chosen a sale morning on purpose, with 200 witnesses, because a man who is humiliated in public makes his decisions fast and makes them badly. "Sign the section over to me today. I'll pay $200 cash on top of clearing the note. You keep the house and 40 acres for 1 year, rent-free, and you walk away from this with money in your pocket and your name clean. 40 acres and no water. 40 acres is more than nothing, which is the alternative. And the creek section. Comes to me, yes. That's what you wanted from the start." Granger's expression didn't shift by a hair. "I want what any man wants, to make a good trade." He looked around the crowd and raised his voice a little. "Every man here knows this outfit is finished. He's got no grass, no water, no hands but an old man and a boy to feed. I'm the only offer he's going to get, and I'm offering more than the ground is worth. If any of you think that's cruelty, my books are open." And the terrible thing, the thing that put a cold weight in Luke's stomach, was that a number of them nodded. "I'm selling the horse," Luke said. $50. That gets me 30 days on the interest, and 30 days from now I'll have the North herd to Hollis, and I'll pay you in full. There's no interest arrangement. It's due on demand, and I'm demanding 30 days. No, 10. "Mr. Callahan." Granger stepped closer and dropped his voice so only the front 2 rows could hear, which was exactly as many as he wanted to hear it. "You seem to think this is a negotiation about money. It isn't. Your father sat in a room with me 8 months ago and told me, in front of witnesses, that no Callahan would ever sell that section to a corporation as long as one of them was breathing." He smiled. "He isn't breathing, so we're testing the theory." Luke moved. He got maybe 6 inches before Amos Teague's hand closed on his arm from behind. Amos, who had followed him into town after all, 4 miles on a bad hip, because he had known exactly how this morning was going to go. "Not here," Amos said quietly. "Not with his men standing right there wanting you to." Luke stood down. His hands were shaking, and he hated that everyone could see it. Granger turned to the corral and looked at the stallion the way a man looks at a debt. "And this is the animal that's going to save you. $50. He laughed, once. "Nobody in this territory will pay $50 for a horse that throws a hog farmer in front of 200 people. "He didn't throw him." Pell pulled his mouth. "A horse takes what he's given," Granger said, which was the second time that morning Luke had heard that sentence, and the second time he'd wanted to put a fist through it. "Here's what he's worth." He came off the fence with the quirt already swinging. Luke would remember it in pieces. The sound, which was not like a whip, and more like a hand slapped hard on a table. The horse going up and back and hitting the rail with a crack that split it. the 200 people making one single noise together, and Granger stepping back out of range with his coat still perfect, saying, "See? Killer, $12, and I'm being generous." Luke came over the rail. Honey got one hand in the collar of that expensive coat and one fist cocked, and Granger's face changed for the first time all morning, a flash of pure animal fear, gone in half a second. But Luke saw it and would remember that too. And then Granger's two men had Luke by both arms, and Amos was between them shouting, and somebody in the crowd hollered, "Let him go! Let the boy go!" And the whole yard tipped toward the kind of thing that ends with a man on the ground and another man in a cell. "That's assault," Granger said, straightening his collar. 200 witnesses. Sheriff's 40 minutes out. He was breathing a little fast. "Sundown, Callahan, sign or I take it with the law and you take that boy of yours to the county home." And that was when the carriage came through the gate. It was not a fancy rig, which surprised people later when they told the story. 4 matched grays, a plain black body, no gilt, no crest. But the horses were the best animals that had been inside that corral fence in 10 years. And every man there who knew anything at all about horses stopped talking at the same time. A big weathered fellow got down off the box and opened the door. And Eleanor Kensington stepped out onto the dust of the Prosper Bend trading post in a gray traveling dress with no jewelry on her at all, except a plain watch pinned at the collar. She was 39 years old. She had run 10,000 acres and 400 head of registered breeding stock and payroll for 61 families since she was 26, alone, after her father died in a wagon accident, and every cattleman in the West sat back to watch her fail. They were still waiting. Nathan Granger's face went through 3 separate expressions in about a second and a half and landed on delight. "Miss Kensington, I didn't expect you." "No," she said. "You didn't." She walked past him the way a person walks past a hitching post, and Luke, held by 2 men, shaking, with his father's horse bleeding a thin line down its face behind him, watched her cross that yard and understood that whatever else was happening, Nathan Granger had just stopped being the most dangerous person present. She stopped 6 feet from the rail. She did not look at Luke. She looked at the horse. "Let go of him," she said. Granger's men looked at Granger. Granger nodded, very slightly, and they let go. Eleanor stood there and did nothing for a long moment. Then she raised one hand, palm down, and held it out. Not toward the horse's head, but low and to the side, offering nothing, asking nothing. Blaze came off the far rail. He crossed the corral. He put his nose in her hand and stood there. 200 people saw it. About 180 of them had watched that same horse dump Cyrus Pell on his backside 40 minutes earlier. "Well," Eleanor said quietly. "Hello." "Miss Kensington, I'd step back," Granger said. "That animal's unpredictable. He's got a quirt cut on his face," she said, still not turning around. "About 4 minutes old. Whose is it?" The silence went on a beat too long. "Mine," Granger said. "He came at me." "He came at you." "He did." She turned around then and looked at him, and Luke watched a man with 11 years of trust behind him fail to hold eye contact with his own employer for 3 full seconds. "Nathan," she said, "I've known that lie since I was 9 years old. Every man who's ever hit a horse in front of me has come at me first." She turned back. "Mr. Callahan, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." "What's his name?" "Blaze." "Who trained him?" "Nobody, ma'am. He wasn't trained. My father just asked him things, and he answered." Something went across her face. It was there and gone. "And what are you asking for him?" $50. Luke's voice came out wrong. He cleared his throat and said it again. $50. "Why 50? "Because that's the interest on my father's note for 30 days, Luke said, and 30 days is all I need. "Except there's no interest arrangement," Granger said. "Miss Kensington, this is a foreclosure matter, and it's frankly beneath—" "Nathan," she said it without raising her voice at all. "Go stand by the scale house." "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me perfectly." He went. He smiled the whole way, and he went. Eleanor ran her hand down the stallion's neck and along his shoulder, and stood back and looked at his legs the way a person looks at a page of numbers. "He's got a bowed tendon healing on the near fore," she said. 10 months back. It's sound now." "How'd you bring it back?" "Cold Creek water twice a day, and I hand-walked him 4 miles a morning for 112 days. 112, yes, ma'am. You counted. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor Kensington was quiet for a moment. Then she said, $50 is an insult. Ma'am, not from you, to you. She turned and faced him, and for the first time she looked at Luke instead of at the horse, and Luke found out that being looked at by that woman was a good deal harder than being looked at by Nathan Granger. This animal is by a steel dust-bred stallion out of a mare with running blood. He's 5 years old. He stands 16 hands. He has clean legs and a healed injury that was rehabilitated properly, which I have seen precisely twice in my life. In Kansas City, he brings $400. In this yard, he brings 50 because everybody standing here judges a horse by whether a fool can sit him. Somebody in the crowd said, "Hey now," and she ignored it entirely. "I'll pay $100, she said. Luke opened his mouth. "On one condition," Eleanor said. "The cowboy comes with him." The yard erupted. It came all at once. Laughter from the back, a whoop, two women's voices going up sharp, somebody hollering something crude enough that Amos Teague turned around with his fists closed. Cyrus Pell said, "What?" loud, twice. Over by the scale house, Nathan Granger's smile went flat as a nail. Eleanor waited. She had the patience of a woman who had spent 13 years waiting for rooms full of men to finish being men. When it dropped enough, she said, "I don't know what you all think you just heard, but I'll say it plain so it doesn't have to travel. I am offering that man a job." "Ma'am," Luke said. His face was burning. "I don't need—" "You do need. Don't insult us both." She stepped closer and lowered her voice, and now it was just the two of them and the horse. "I employ 9 men whose entire occupation is horses. 2 of them are good. None of them could have brought that tendon back. I've buried $4,000 of breeding stock in 3 years to injuries and to temper, and I have sat in my own barn at 2 in the morning with a mare I could not settle, and I have thought, there has to be somebody, somewhere, who knows how to ask." Her jaw tightened. "Then I ride into this yard and watch a horse nobody can touch walk across it to a stranger's hand because you spent 5 years teaching him that a hand is a safe place to be. Mr. Callahan, I'm not being kind to you. I'm being greedy." Luke stood there with his hat in his hands and no idea what to do with his face. $100 for the horse," she said. $40 a month for the man. That's more than any wage in this territory, and I'll hear about it from my foreman for a year, and I don't care." $40 a month, Luke said. 40. "For how long?" 1 year. After that, we'll both know." Amos Teague made a small, strangled noise behind him. 40 a month was $480 a year. The note was $460. And Luke Callahan, 28 years old, with his father 11 weeks in the ground, and a 14-year-old boy sitting on a step 4 miles away refusing to watch, heard himself say, "No, ma'am." The crowd made a sound like the air going out of a room. Eleanor's eyebrows went up about a 1/4 inch. "No. Not like that." "Explain." "Because you're not greedy," Luke said. "Or you are, but that's not all of it. You watched a man take a quirt to my horse, and you watched 2 of his men hold my arms, and you decided to hand me a way out in front of everybody so I wouldn't have to take his $200. And I'm—" His voice caught, and he made it go on anyway. "I'm grateful. I want you to know that I'm grateful. But if I get on your wagon today, every man in this yard is going to say Dan Callahan's boy got saved by a rich woman, and my brother's going to hear it at the feed store for the rest of his life." Nobody in the crowd said a word. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said, "then negotiate." "Ma'am?" "You just told me my offer's no good. Fine, that's what negotiating is. Make me one." Luke's mind went white for about 2 seconds. Then it started working, and later he'd realized that was the exact moment his life changed direction. Not the offer, but the 2 seconds after it. 60 days, he said. "Go on." 60 days of work, not a year. You pay the 100 for the horse today. You advance me the rest against wages, 360. And I hand it straight to Granger this afternoon in front of these people, and I take his paper off him. Then I owe you, not him. And I work it off at 40 a month till the debt's clear. And if I'm no good to you at the end of 60 days, you send me home and I still owe you every dollar, and I'll pay it if it takes me 6 years. And if you are good to me at the end of 60 days, then we'll both know, Luke said. Eleanor Kensington smiled for the first time that morning. It was not a large smile. "One correction," she said. 45 a month. Because the number you just built has you in my debt for 10 months, and I want you out of it in 8, and I want you to know the difference between a wage and a leash." She put out her hand. "Do we have an agreement?" He shook it. Her grip was harder than he expected, and there were calluses across the base of her fingers that a woman who had never held a rein would not have had. The crowd started up again to noise, argument, three separate people trying to tell the story to each other before it had finished happening. And Cyrus Pell shouted, $18 was a fair offer, at nobody at all. And Nathan Granger came off the scale house wall. "Miss Kensington, a word. Say it here. I'd rather say it here, Nathan." He came close enough that only 3 people could hear, and Luke was one of them. His voice was still perfectly pleasant. "You've just paid $460 to buy a stranger out of a hole, in public, in front of 200 people who will have it in every town in this county by Thursday. Do you understand what they'll say? That I overpaid for a horse. That is not what they'll say." "Then they'll say something uglier, and I'll survive it," Eleanor said. "I've been buried and dug up by this territory twice already. It's the 3rd time that worries me." She looked at him. "You'll draw up the release this afternoon." Granger didn't move. "I bought that note as an investment for the estate." "Then the estate will be repaid in full today, with a profit, and you'll have done very well." She paused. "Unless the estate wasn't the purchaser." The pause after that lasted maybe a second and a half. "Of course it was." "It was," Granger said. "Then there's no difficulty," she said, and turned away. And Luke, who had spent that entire morning being looked at, laughed at, held by the arms, and told what he was worth, happened to be standing at the right angle to see Nathan Granger's face in the half-second when nobody with any power was pointed at him. There was no anger in it. That's what stopped Luke's breath. He'd expected anger. A man who's been humiliated by his employer in a public yard ought to look angry. Granger looked afraid. Then it was gone, and he was smiling again, calling for his men, calling for a clerk, saying, "Of course, absolutely. I'll have the release drawn by 2 o'clock." And the yard was full of noise and dust, and Amos Teague was gripping Luke's shoulder hard enough to hurt and saying something Luke couldn't hear. Eleanor was at the carriage. She stopped with one hand on the door. "Mr. Callahan." "Ma'am." "Your father's name was Daniel." It wasn't a question. Luke went still. "Yes, ma'am." "He shot horses in the Poudre Valley in 81 and 82. "He did." Luke's voice came out strange. "Before he took up the place. How do you—" "He worked 11 days for my father one spring," Eleanor said. "There was a stud colt nobody could get a hand on. 2 trainers quit. My father sent for a farrier because he'd heard the man was patient." She looked out across the corral at the bay stallion, at the crooked white slash down his face, at the thin dark line of the quirt cut over it. "I was 14. I sat on that fence for 11 days and watched a man do absolutely nothing to a horse until the horse walked up to him." She got into the carriage. "Be at the north gate Thursday morning," she said. "Bring your brother. Bring the old man, too. I'll find him something. And Mr. Callahan—" The door was half closed. "When you hand Nathan Granger that money this afternoon, count it out slow and watch his hands." The carriage went out through the gate, and the dust came up behind it and hung there. And Luke Callahan stood in the middle of the Prosper Bend trading post with $100 he hadn't been paid yet, and a debt that was about to change owners and 200 people talking about him. He walked over to the corral. Blaze put his head over the rail. Luke stood with his forehead against the horse's neck for a while, longer than he meant to, and he did not let one single person in that yard see his face. "He'd have liked her," Amos said, coming up beside him. "Your daddy." "I don't know what just happened," Luke said. "You got saved is what happened." "No." Luke lifted his head. Across the yard, Nathan Granger was talking to a clerk and smiling and writing something down and looking at nothing at all. And every 10 or 15 seconds, his eyes came back to Luke and moved off again, quick, like a man checking a fire he's not sure is out. "No, that's the part that's wrong. She didn't save me, Amos. She hired me, and he's not sore about the money." Amos followed his look. "Then what's he sore about?" "That's it," Luke said slowly. "He isn't sore at all. He's scared." Amos snorted. "Scared of what? You?" Luke watched Nathan Granger fold a piece of paper and put it in his coat, and he thought about a man who buys a dying rancher's note in secret 3 weeks after the funeral, and asks a banker a great many questions about a creek with no water in it, and offers $200 for a section of ground that 4 counties agreed was worthless. "I don't know," he said, "but he was scared before he ever laid eyes on me. He got scared the second she said I was coming to the valley. Behind them, the stallion shifted his weight and blew out a long breath, and the cut on his face had already stopped bleeding. The release was drawn at 2:10 in the back room of the scale house, on a table that still had grain dust in the seams of it, and Nathan Granger was so pleasant about the whole business that 3 separate men who watched it happen went home and told their wives what a decent fellow he'd turned out to be. He had a clerk with him, a thin, nervous man named Pruitt, who wrote a beautiful hand and never once looked up. He had the release and a receipt book, and a leather case with a brass catch that he set on the far end of the table where nobody could reach it but him. "360 from Miss Kensington, 100 for the horse," Granger said. "460 even. You'll want to count it." "I will. By all means." So Luke counted it, and he counted it the way she'd told him to. Slow. 1 bill at a time, laid flat, and between every 5th bill he stopped and squared the stack, and he did not once look at the money. He looked at Granger's hands. They were steady through the first 100, steady through the second. On the third, the fingers of the right hand started walking, very slightly, on the tabletop. A little rolling motion, thumb to forefinger, like a man counting something that wasn't there. When Luke got to 400, Granger reached over and pulled the leather case an inch closer to himself without seeming to notice he'd done it. 460, Luke said. "Where's the note?" "The release discharges it." "That's not what I asked. My father signed an original instrument." "Where is it?" "Filed." "Filed where?" Granger smiled. "Mr. Callahan, you've had a difficult morning and I don't hold it against you, but you're asking questions the way a man asks. Who's read one book about paper and thinks it makes him a lawyer? The release is the operative document. Pruitt, read him the language." Pruitt read the language. It was good language. Luke understood about 2/3 of it. "Then let me see the assignment," Luke said. "The one you held up in the yard this morning for 200 people. You were happy enough to show it then." The room got quiet in a way that made Pruitt's pen stop. "It's the estate's property." "You said that in the yard too. You said you bought it as an investment for the estate. So it's Miss Kensington's paper, and Miss Kensington's money just cleared it, and I'll take it kindly if you'd let me look at the front page of a document that's got my dead father's name on it." Granger looked at him for a moment. Then he opened the case, took out the assignment, and laid it on the table face up, and stood there with his hand flat on the bottom third of it. Luke read what he could see. Assignment of note and deed of trust. Cattleman's Trust of Prosper Bend, assigner. And in the blank for the assignee, in Pruitt's beautiful hand, Granger Land and Livestock Company, agent, for the account of undersigned principal. "For the account of undersigned principal," Luke read out loud. "Standard. Who's the principal?" "The estate." "Then it'd say the estate." Luke put one finger on the tabletop next to the paper, not touching it. "You've got your hand over the signature line." "I've got my hand on my own document." "Move it." "No." They looked at each other. Amos Teague, who had been standing by the door with his hat in both hands, doing an excellent impression of an old man not paying attention, said mildly, "Mr. Granger, that boy just handed you $460 in front of witnesses. Seems like he's earned a look at what he bought." "He bought nothing. He discharged an obligation. There's a difference, and it's the whole of the law." Granger folded the assignment in half, closed it in the case, and clicked the brass catch. "You'll have your release, Pruitt. Date it and give it to him. And Mr. Callahan, I'd like to say something to you, and I'd like you to hear it in the spirit it's given." "Go ahead." "I don't dislike you." Granger said it simply, and for once it sounded true. "I've been where you were standing this morning. My father lost a mill in Ohio when I was 19, and I watched 3 men in good coats take it apart over a table exactly like this one. So I know what you feel toward me, and I don't blame you for it." He picked up the case. "But you're about to go work for a woman who makes decisions with her heart in the middle of an operation that will not survive a single sentimental year. And if you have any sense at all, you'll take her wages, pay your debt, and go home to that ranch. Don't get comfortable. Don't get curious. People who get curious in that valley have a way of finding out they weren't as necessary as they thought." "That sounds like a threat." "It's the opposite," Granger said. "It's the only piece of free advice you're going to get from anybody this year." He put on his hat. "Good afternoon." He was at the door when Luke said, "Mr. Granger." "Yes?" "You said my father sat in a room with you 8 months ago." "I did." "He was already sick 8 months ago. He couldn't sit a horse past November." Luke picked up the release and folded it into his shirt. So whatever room that was, you went to him. He didn't go to you. Granger's expression didn't change at all, and that was the answer. Safe travels Thursday, he said, and went out. Prewitt gathered his things very fast and did not make eye contact with anyone, and at the door he stopped and half-turned, and for about 2 seconds it looked like the thin, nervous man was going to say something. "Mister," Luke said, "whatever it is." Prewitt swallowed. "The 22nd, he said. "You mind the 22nd? And then he was gone across the yard at a walk that was almost a run. Amos waited until the room was empty. The 22nd's the date on the assignment. "It's the date Voss gave me, too." "So?" "So the 22nd of last month," Luke said slowly, "was the day of my father's funeral. There were 60 people at that graveyard, Amos, and the bank was shut, and Harlan Voss was standing at the back of it with his hat off." Amos was quiet. "He didn't sell that paper on the 22nd, Luke said. "He sold it before, and they wrote the 22nd on it after, because a man buying a dying rancher's debt 3 weeks before he's dead looks like exactly what it is. Or Voss just wrote a wrong number. Maybe. You gonna tell her?" Luke thought about it the whole 4 miles home, and by the time he got to the gate, he'd decided that he'd been on the Kensington payroll for 4 hours, and telling the richest woman in the territory that her chief administrator was a forger on the strength of a date and a bad feeling was a fine way to be back at Prosper Bend by Friday. He was wrong about that, and it would cost him. Toby was on the porch step. He hadn't moved. There was a small pile of shavings by his boot, and the stick was mostly gone. Luke sat down next to him and put the release on the boards between them. "What's that?" "It's the note, paid." Toby didn't touch it. "You sold him." "I did." "How much?" "100. Pa said, "I know what Pa said." "You don't get to know what Pa said and do it anyway," Toby said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and he hated that so much that he stood up. That's worse than not knowing. Sit down." "No." "Toby, he's 4 miles from here in a stranger's corral, and you're sitting on the porch," Toby said. "That's the whole thing. That's all of it. You can talk about notes and interest till the sun comes up, and that's still what happened." And Luke, tired, sunburned, still shaking somewhere under the ribs from a morning he hadn't finished having, said the worst thing he could have said. "You want to keep a horse, or you want to keep a house? Because you can't have both, and I'm the one that had to pick, and you're 14, so you don't get a say in it." Toby went white. "Toby!" The boy went inside and shut the door, and Luke sat on the step with his own words hanging in the air around him like flies. Amos came up and leaned on the post and said nothing for a while. "I shouldn't have said that." "No," Amos agreed. "He's got a right to be sore." "He does." "You could argue the other side a little," Luke said, "for company." "I could." Amos scratched his jaw. "Your daddy said a thing to me once, when you were about that boy's age and giving him fits about something. He said, 'The trouble with raising a kid on principle is one day he'll use it on you, and you'll have to decide whether you meant it.'" He pushed off the post. "You meant it. That's the whole problem." Luke put his head in his hands. "He'll come around," Amos said. "Boys do. But you're going to have to go in there tonight and tell him what happens Thursday. And Luke, tell him all of it. Don't manage him. He's had enough of being managed by grown men who thought they were protecting him." Wednesday, a little before noon, 2 men came up the creek section with a transit and a bundle of stakes. Luke saw them from the barn and walked down without hurrying. Toby came behind him without being asked, which was the first thing the boy had done voluntarily in his direction since Monday. "Afternoon," Luke said. "Afternoon." The one with the transit didn't look up. "You'd be Callahan." "I'd be." "We're shooting a line for a head gate." He wrote something in a book. "Diversion structure, 30-inch, with a settling basin about where you're standing." "On my land." "On the..." The man checked the book. "On the section under contract to Meridian." The word went through Luke like cold water. "Say that name again." "Meridian Land and Water. That's who's paying us." The surveyor finally looked up and saw Luke's face, and something in him got cautious. "Mister, I just shoot lines. I got a work order out of Denver with a section number on it." "Show me." "I can't do that." "Show me the number then. Just the number." The surveyor hesitated, then turned the book around and held it up. Luke read the section, township and range. It was his creek. It was every foot of his creek, and about 200 acres of the flat above it that had never been part of any negotiation anybody had ever mentioned to him. That contract's dead, Luke said. The note was paid yesterday afternoon. I've got the release in the house. I don't know anything about a note. Then you're standing on a man's land with no right to it, and you've got about a minute to be somewhere else. They went. They went slowly, and with a good deal of muttering, and one of them said something about coming back with the sheriff, and Toby stood beside his brother the whole time with his fists closed at his sides. When the wagon was out of sight, Luke walked the line and pulled every stake out of the ground, and Toby carried them, and they threw the whole bundle in the wagon bed. "What's Meridian?" Toby said. "I don't know." "You went white as a sheet." "I did." Luke looked at the dry creek, at the cracked mud, at the cottonwoods along it that were still green because their roots went down to something the surface had forgotten. "Toby, listen. When Pa dug that well in '86, why'd he dig it there, right up against the bank where the digging's worst? Because that's where the water was." "That's where the water is," Luke said. "Not was. There's a live spring under that bank, and it never quit. Not once, not in 11 months of no rain. It's just small. Too small to run a creek, plenty big to fill a tank." He turned around slowly, looking up the draw. "And if you put a headgate right there and a ditch out along that flat, you could water 4,000 acres of somebody else's dry ground and charge them for it." Toby stared at him. "That's why he wanted it." "That's why he wanted it. So it ain't worthless." "It's worth more than everything Granger offered me, times 10, Luke said. "And my father knew it, and he'd rather have died owing $460 than sell it." Toby was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you didn't sell his horse to save a worthless ranch?" "No." "You could have led with that," Toby said, and it was almost, not quite, but almost the way he used to talk before November. They got to the north gate of Kensington Valley at 20 minutes past 6 on Thursday morning, which was 10 minutes early, and Luke found out immediately that 10 minutes early meant 20 minutes late. The gate was 2 stone pillars with no ornament on them, and the road past it ran straight for a mile and a half through fenced pasture where more good horses were grazing than Luke had seen in his entire life put together. He counted 11 mares with foals at side before he stopped counting because it was starting to make him feel strange. Amos, on the wagon seat, said, "Sweet mother." "Don't stare," Luke said. "You're staring." "I know it." The big weathered fellow from the carriage was waiting at the second gate on a stocky roan. Up close he was about 55, with a nose that had been broken and reset badly and one eyelid that drooped. "Otis Pike," he said. "Miss Kensington's stock manager, which means I do whatever she's tired of doing. You're Callahan." "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. I work for a living." He looked at Amos, then at Toby. "That's more people than she told me about. She said bring my brother and the old man. She says a lot of things and then goes to Denver." Pike sighed. "Boy, you'll bunk with the 2 Hollis kids over the tack room, and you'll take orders from Mrs. Finch about your schooling, and if I catch you in the breeding barn, I'll skin you. Old-timer, can you drive a team without arguing with it? 51 years. Then you're the hay wagon, and you've just made 3 men happy." Pike turned the roan. "Callahan, you ride with me, and I'll say this once so we don't have to keep circling it. Everybody in this valley knows what she said in that yard on Monday. All of it. Word for word, and about 4 words that never got said. 61 families worked this ground, and by yesterday afternoon, every one of them had an opinion. I figured. You didn't figure enough. There's men here been on this payroll 20 years waiting for a raise, and you came in Monday at 45 a month. Pike spat. "So you'll be wanting to work like your hair's on fire for about a month, and you'll be wanting to eat your supper without answering anybody, and you'll be wanting to keep your hands where I can see them around the young stock. Understood?" "Understood." "Good. Now the actual problem." Pike's voice changed, and Luke heard the thing under the gruffness for the first time. "You're not here for a job. You're here for one horse." She'd never say it that way, but that's what it is. "Which horse?" "Sovereign," Pike said, and the roan under him shifted like even the animal knew the name. 9-year-old stallion, 14 registered get on the ground, and every one of them worth $600 before they're weaned. He is the whole future of this outfit standing on 4 legs. He looked straight ahead. 6 weeks ago, he put Del Marsh through a stall wall. Del's 43, and he's not going to use that arm again. 2 weeks after that, he came at me. Last Tuesday, he wouldn't let a man in the barn with a bucket, and the vet from Greeley says put him down, and Nathan Granger's been saying put him down since the day Dell got hurt, and she's been saying no, and the whole valley thinks she's gone soft in the head over a horse. What's Granger say to do with the mares? Pike glanced over, quick and sharp. That's a peculiar first question. It's the only question. You destroy a stallion mid-season. What happens to a book of mares already paid for? They go out to outside stud. Granger's already got 3 lined up. Pike's jaw worked. At $150 a mare paid to the stud owner. Who are the stud owners? Now that, Pike said, after a while, is a question nobody's asked out loud. The stallion barn stood off by itself at the end of a lane, and it was quiet the way a room is quiet when everybody in it is trying not to wake something. 4 men were standing outside it. One of them, a big red-faced hand of about 35, was leaning on the door with his arms crossed, and he straightened up when he saw Luke and grinned at the others. "Well, hell," he said. "That's $100 Cowboy." "Roof," Pike said. "I'm just admiring. That's more than I got paid for my whole first year." Roof Dolan came off the door. "Tell me something, friend. She pay by the hour or by the—" Luke hit him. He was not proud of it. He would not be proud of it a week later or a year later, and when he thought about it afterward, what he mostly remembered was the sound the other 3 men made, and Pike not moving at all from the saddle, and his own knuckles hurting in a distant sort of way. Roof sat down in the dirt with his hand over his mouth. "Now that," Pike said calmly, "was stupid, and it's cost you a month of everybody's goodwill, and I'd have done the same at your age." He got down off the roan. "Dolan, you started it, and if you tell it different, I'll tell it true. Everybody else, back up." Roof got up. There was blood on his teeth. "You're finished here." "Probably," Luke said. "Open the door." "What?" "The barn. Open it." Roof laughed and looked around at the others, and there was something ugly and delighted in his face. "You want in there?" "Pike, he wants in there." "He does," Pike said. "Open it." They opened it, and Luke went in alone, and somebody slid it shut behind him. The barn was dim, and it smelled wrong. That was the first thing. It smelled like a place where the manure had been mucked, but the bedding hadn't been changed down deep in weeks, because nobody had been willing to stand in the stall long enough to do it properly. Down at the far end, a big dark bay came against the front of his box hard enough to rock the whole wall. Luke stopped where he was, about 40 feet away, and did nothing. Sovereign screamed at him. He came at the boards twice more, and then he backed and swung his hindquarters around and cow-kicked the side wall. And one of the men outside said something and somebody laughed, and Luke stood in the aisle with his hands hanging down and looked. Not at the horse, at the stall. There was a full manger of hay, and it hadn't been touched. There was a water bucket hung high in the corner on a chain, out of a man's easy reach, which meant somebody had been filling it from the aisle with a pole. There were dark stains on the wood at about chest height on the front wall of the box where a horse would rub, and the top rail of the door was chewed raw. Luke sat down. Right there in the aisle, in the dirt, cross-legged, 40 feet away. 5 minutes went by. The horse came at the door once more and then stopped and stood shaking. 10 minutes, 15. Outside, somebody rattled the door and Pike's voice said something short, and the rattling stopped. At about 20 minutes, Sovereign put his head over the door and did something that Luke had been waiting for without knowing it. He yawned, enormously. And when his mouth opened all the way, he flinched and jerked his head sideways and pinned his ears at nothing at all. Luke got up. He walked to the stall and he was talking the whole way in a low, flat voice about absolutely nothing. About a wagon axle, about the price of nails, about a hog farmer named Cyrus Pell who got dumped in front of 200 people. And he stopped at the door with his hands at his sides and let the horse come to him, or not. It took 11 minutes. When Sovereign finally stretched his neck out and touched Luke's forearm with his nose, Luke did not move. He counted to 60. Then he turned his hand over, palm up, and slid it slowly along the underside of the jaw, and pressed with 2 fingers on a spot about 3 inches back from the corner of the mouth. The stallion went straight up on his hind legs, and Luke stepped back into the aisle and let him. He walked to the barn door and slid it open, and the 4 men outside came off the fence. "Well?" Roof said. "Still got both arms?" "How long's he been eating out of that high manger?" Nobody answered. "Otis," Luke said. "How long?" Pike frowned. The manger's been where it is 9 years. No, there's a bracket hole 4 inches lower with new wood in it and old paint around it. Somebody raised that manger. When? Pike looked at Roof. Roof's face had changed. Spring, Roof said. Granger had the barn crew do the whole row, said high mangers keep the stallions from throwing feed. High mangers make a horse eat with his neck stretched and his pole up, Luke said. That's not why he's dangerous, but it's why nobody caught it. Otis, I need a twitch, 2 men, a lamp, and whoever in this valley can pull a tooth. A tooth, Roof said. He's got a fractured upper cheek tooth on the near side, and I'd bet the whole of what I owe there's an abscess up in the bone behind it. That's why he strikes when a man comes at his head. That's why he took Del Marsh through a wall. Del was reaching for his halter, wasn't he? Left side. Silence. Left side, Pike said quietly. He's been in that box 6 weeks in pain with his feed hung, where he has to lift his head to reach it, and every man who's walked in here has walked in expecting a killer, and a horse in pain will take exactly what you expect and give it back to you double. Luke wiped his hands on his thighs. He was shaking a little, and he didn't want anybody to see it. I need that lamp. Roof Dolan stood there with blood dried on his chin. I'll get the lamp, he said. They had the tooth out by 4 o'clock that afternoon, and it came out in 3 pieces, and the smell of what came with it emptied half the barn. The valley vet, a young man named Sowerby, who had driven 11 miles because Pike had sent a rider at a gallop, held the biggest fragment up to the light and said, That's been going 6-8 weeks. That's not new. Would a man have seen it? Pike said. A man would have had to look, Sowerby said, in his mouth, which nobody was going to do because everybody knew he was a killer. Eleanor Kensington got back from Greeley at 7:30 that evening and came straight to the stallion barn still in her traveling clothes, and found her 9-year-old stud horse standing with his head down over a low manger, eating soaked mash, and a cowboy asleep sitting up in the aisle with his back against a post. She stood in the doorway for a while. Otis. Ma'am. Tell me. Pike told her. It took 4 minutes. When he got to the manger, she made a small sound. I signed that work order, she said, the barn improvements, in March. Nathan brought it to me with about 40 other things. Yes, ma'am. Wake him up. He's been at it 11 hours. Otis, wake him up. Luke came up out of it fast and got to his feet too quick and had to put a hand on the post. Mr. Callahan. Ma'am. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want the true answer, not the polite one. Eleanor's face was perfectly composed, and her hands were not. If nobody had looked in that horse's mouth for another 2 weeks, what happens? He'd have got the abscess through into the sinus, Luke said. Then it goes to the bone. Then you'd have put him down, and everybody would have said it was temper. And that would have been true, as far as anyone could prove. Yes, ma'am. And I would have believed it, she said. That's the part. I'd have signed the order myself and gone up to the house and cried about it, and believed it for the rest of my life. She turned and looked down the aisle at the horse. How much did the tooth cost me? Sowerby charged $4. $4, Eleanor said, and the outside stud fees for a book of 31 mares at $150 a head would have come to $4,650, paid out of this estate to 3 men I have never met. Nobody in that barn said anything at all. Otis, she said, who picked those 3 studs? Ma'am, I'd rather you asked him yourself. I'm asking you. Pike looked at the floor. Mr. Granger did. Eleanor stood very still for about 5 seconds. Mr. Callahan, she said, didn't you read a ledger? I can read a tally book. I've never seen a real ledger in my life. Then you'll learn on mine, she said. Be at the office at 6. Bring your own eyes and leave your opinions at the door until I ask for them. The estate office was a long room on the north side of the main house with a window that faced the barns, and it held 11 years of the Kensington Valley estate in leather-bound books that stood in a row like a fence. Mrs. Ada Finch kept them. She was 62, thin as a rail, and she had a way of setting a book down that was almost gentle. You'll want the stock ledger, she said. That's the one everybody wants. I don't know what I want. Ada Finch looked at him over her spectacles for a moment, and something in her face relaxed by a hair. That's the first honest thing anybody's said in this room in 5 years, she said. Sit down. She showed him how a page worked. Left side in, right side out. Date, description, folio reference, amount. She showed him the brand inspection book and the auction returns and the hay contracts and the payroll sheets. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, Luke Callahan's head was full of a language he'd never heard spoken. He was no good with the numbers. He'd be the first to say it, and he said it out loud twice that first week. And the second time, Ada Finch snapped at him that numbers were the easiest part, and if he'd stop apologizing, he might notice he was already doing the hard part. Because what Luke had, and what nobody in that office had ever had, was 11 years of standing in a barn. Mrs. Finch, this hay contract. Yes. 210 tons, delivered June through August, Halverson and Sons. That's right. Where'd you put it? She blinked. In the barns. Which barns? Because I've walked every one of them this week and I've counted the mow space, and the whole valley holds about 140 tons if you stack it to the rafters and step on it. He put his finger on the page. And this says you took 210 in a drought year and paid $9 a ton for it, which is $1,890. And I've been feeding horses out of the West Mow all week, and it's oat straw underneath. Somebody put good hay across the front of the stack and straw behind it. Ada Finch's hand came up to her collar. Mrs. Finch? Show me the mow, she said. Show me it now. He showed her the mow, and she stood in the west barn in her good dress with straw dust settling on her shoulders, and she did not say a word for a long time. There was a man before me, she said finally. Mr. Corliss. He kept these books for 4 years, and he was very good, and he was fond of my late husband. She was looking at the straw. In the winter of '86, he came to my kitchen at 9 at night and asked me if I thought a person had a duty to a thing they only half understood. I said I didn't know. 2 weeks later, he took a position in Sacramento and left in 4 days, and he never wrote me once, and Mr. Corliss was a man who wrote thank you letters for a cup of coffee. Mrs. Finch, did you ever ask? I asked Mr. Granger, she said. He said Mr. Corliss had family trouble and it was kinder not to discuss it. She turned around. I have thought about that answer for 3 years, young man, and I have never once thought about it in the daytime. They found 4 more things that week, and none of them was proof, and every one of them was a splinter. There were payroll entries for a T. Hollis, a J. Reese, and a Cordell M., drawing $30 a month apiece out of the general account. And Otis Pike had never heard of any of them, and neither had the cookhouse. And a man who eats nowhere and sleeps nowhere is generally not a man. There were auction returns from the Cheyenne Fall sale showing 9 geldings sold at an average of $41. And Luke, who had stood at that same rail 3 Octobers running with his father, said flatly that no sound gelding out of registered stock had gone under 70 at that sale in a decade. There were 3 colts in the North Pasture whose freeze brands matched 3 entries in the ledger marked sold, disposed, off inventory. Luke walked out and read them off the hips himself, and came back and read them off the page. And Ada Finch put both hands flat on the desk and said, Say those numbers again, slowly. And there was Meridian. It was in the ledger 4 times, small, in the general expense column, under a heading of water assessment, sundry. $200 in April, $200 in May, $400 in June, $650 in July. What's a water assessment? Luke said. A ditch company charges the users along it for maintenance. It's ordinary. Which ditch? Ada Finch turned the page and turned it back and turned it again. It doesn't say, she said. On the last Friday of that month, Nathan Granger came back into the valley. He came at noon with 2 riders, and he went to the main house first and was told Miss Kensington was at the North Pasture, and then he came down to the barns, and he found Luke Callahan sitting on an overturned bucket outside the stallion barn with a plate of cold beans, and the stallion loose in the run behind him with his head over the fence like a dog waiting on a table. Granger looked at the horse for a good while. They tell me it was a tooth. It was. $4. 4. That's remarkable. He sounded like he meant it. Truly. I'd have put that animal down myself and I'd have been wrong, and I'm not a man who enjoys saying that. You did try to put him down. I did, because I had a veterinarian's opinion in writing and a man with a ruined arm and 31 mares booked. Those are the facts I had. Granger set his hat on the rail. You had better facts. That's not a crime and it isn't a virtue. It's luck and a good eye, and I'll give you credit for both in front of anybody who asks. Luke set the plate down. You want something? I do. Granger's voice stayed pleasant. You owe this estate $360 less what you've earned, which by my arithmetic is about $270 today. I'll pay it. Personally, out of my own pocket, this afternoon, and I'll take your paper and burn it in front of you, and you'll ride out of this valley clear with your brother and your old man and $100 besides. Why? Because you're going to get her hurt. Say that plainer. All right. Granger leaned on the rail. You've spent 3 weeks in that office with a woman who is frightened of her own filing cabinets. You've found some things. Some of them are real. I'll say that to your face, because there's 40 men on that payroll book, and I'd be a liar to swear every one of them is honest. And you're going to take those things to her, and she's going to do what she does, which is put her whole chest out in front of it. She'll bring in lawyers. She'll bring in accountants out of Denver. He shook his head slowly. And do you know what happens to a ranching operation in this territory when word gets out that its books are being examined? Every buyer who owes her money slows down. Every bank that carries her paper calls it in. Every neighbor who's been waiting 13 years for that woman to fail smells it in 1 week. So the fix is she never looks. The fix, Granger said, is that a man handles it quietly from the inside over a year or two, and nobody outside the fence ever hears a word, which is exactly what I have been doing. Luke stood up. That's a good speech, he said. I believed about half of it, and that's the most I've ever believed of anything you've said, so you're improving. He picked up the plate. But you left something out. Have I? Meridian land and water, Luke said, and watched. He'd been waiting 3 weeks to watch, and he'd promised himself he'd keep his mouth shut, and he broke that promise because he was 28 years old and tired and had wanted just once to see the man's face change. He got it. Nathan Granger's face did not go pale and it did not go angry. It went empty, all at once, the way a lamp goes out. Where did you hear that name? 2 surveyors on my creek, working a headgate line for Meridian. Luke kept his voice level. That was Wednesday the 14th. That's 2 days after you told 200 people at Prosper Bend that you bought my father's note as an investment for this estate. Surveyors get orders wrong. They do. And a ditch company gets an assessment paid to it 4 times out of this estate's general account, and nobody in that office can tell me which ditch. Luke put his hat on. So here's my answer to your offer. I'm going to work off what I owe. I'm going to do it in 8 months like she said. And every single day between now and then, I'm going to be in that barn and in that office and out on that ground with my eyes open. You can pay me $270 or you can pay me $2,700 and I'll still be here. Granger picked up his hat. You know what your father's mistake was? He said quietly. It wasn't the well. It wasn't the drought. He got asked a reasonable question by a reasonable man, and he decided the answer had to be a matter of honor. He put the hat on. It never has to be. That's what nobody ever tells you. It never, ever has to be. He walked back up the lane, and he did not look back once, and behind him the stallion pinned his ears and followed him along the fence line the entire length of the run. That night, in the small office he kept above the estate's freight barn, Nathan Granger sat with a lamp turned low and did arithmetic on a sheet of paper that he burned when he was finished. Then he wrote a letter. It was 3 sentences long. Prewitt came at 11, sweating, and stood by the door. Take this to the Cheyenne stage in the morning, not the Valley Post, the stage. Yes, sir. Prewitt took it and hesitated. Sir, Mr. Wicks came by the office Tuesday. He wanted to know about the September remittance, and I told him, I know what you told him. Sir, if the September remittance doesn't go out, Meridian's charter lapses, and if the charter lapses, then the assessments. Prewitt. Granger did not raise his voice. Sit down. The clerk sat. Do you know why I've never worried, in 11 years, about anyone in this valley opening those books? Granger turned the lamp up a little. Because Ada Finch is loyal, Otis Pike can't read past a tally sheet, and Eleanor Kensington has never once in 13 years wanted to know. She doesn't want to know. She wants to be told, and being told is a thing I control. He set his pen down. A ledger only speaks to someone who stood in the barn, and no one who stands in the barn has ever been let in this room. Until now, Prewitt said. Until now. Outside, a long way off, somebody was walking a horse in the dark, and the sound of it came up through the open window, steady and unhurried, again and again along the fence line. Granger listened to it for a while. Prewitt, he said, how's your brother-in-law, the one in Laramie who handles the stock cars? Prewitt's mouth went dry. He's well. Write to him too, Granger said. The letter left on the Cheyenne stage Saturday morning, and for 11 days after that, nothing happened at all, which Luke Callahan would later understand was the point. He spent those 11 days learning the shape of a place that had been running for 40 years without him. He learned that the cookhouse served at 5, and if you weren't sitting by 10 past, you ate cold. He learned that Otis Pike's drooping eyelid came from a mule and not, as 3 separate hands swore, from a fight in Dodge City. He learned that Ruth Dolan had a wife named Pearl and 4 children and had been asking for a $2 raise since the spring of '87, and that the reason Ruth had said what he said outside the stallion barn was not that he was a cruel man, but that he was a tired one, and Luke had knocked him down for it in front of his crew. He learned that last part because of Toby. Ruth Dolan's boy told me you got his daddy in trouble, Toby said one evening, sitting on the fence rail with his heels hooked in. I did. He said his ma cried about it. Luke stopped what he was doing. He said if his daddy loses the place, they got to go to her people in Kansas. Toby wasn't looking at him. He was very carefully not looking at him. I ain't saying you were wrong. I'm just saying it. Luke found Ruth the next morning mucking the east row and stood in the aisle for about a minute working out how to open his mouth, and finally said the only thing he had. I was out of line. Ruth kept forking. I'd had 4 hours sleep and a man said a thing about a woman who just kept my brother in a house, and I hit him for it, and that's my reason, and it isn't good enough. Luke picked up the other fork off the wall. I'm not asking you to shake my hand. I'm asking you which end you want. Ruth stopped. He looked at the fork and at Luke and back at the fork. You take the far end, he said. It's worse down there. They mucked 11 stalls without saying anything, and at the end of it, Ruth leaned on his handle and said, That $2 I've been asking after. I heard. Pike says the money's there. Pike said the money's there 4 years running, and every year the general account comes up short in September, and every year Mr. Granger sits me down and explains it to me like I'm a child, and I go home and tell Pearl next year. He wiped his face. That's my whole grievance with you. It ain't the 45 a month. It's that somebody found it in one afternoon. Found what? Whatever it is. Ruth hung the fork on the wall. Don't play stupid with me, Callahan. I got no schooling, but I ain't blind. Mrs. Finch has had that office lamp burning past midnight for 3 weeks, and she's a woman who's in bed by 9, and you come out of there some mornings looking like you've been kicked. He picked up his hat. So when you find it, all the way find it, because I got 4 kids, and I ain't got another 4 years. That was the 11th day. On the 12th, a man named Wicks came into the valley. He came in a hired buggy, alone, and he did not go to the barns. He went to the main house and asked for Miss Kensington by name, and when he was told she was riding the north fence, he said he'd wait, and he waited 2 hours and 40 minutes in the front room with his hat on his knee, refusing coffee. Luke saw the buggy from the lane and went and stood in the shade of the freight barn where he could see the door. Eleanor came in at 4:30, still in her riding clothes, dust to the knee, and she was in that room 18 minutes. Luke was still there when the man came out. He was about 60, small, gray, with a neat beard and the softest boots Luke had ever seen on a man in that country. He got into the buggy and picked up the lines and then stopped and looked around the yard, and his eyes went over the barns the way a man looks at a room he's thinking of buying. Then he saw Luke. He didn't nod. He didn't look away either. He just took Luke in, top to bottom, for about 3 seconds, and there was nothing in his face at all. No curiosity, no hostility, nothing. It was the way a man looks at a fence post to see if it needs replacing. Then he drove out. Luke went up to the house. Ada Finch met him at the office door with her hand still on the knob. Not now. Mrs. Finch, I said not now. Behind her, through the half-open door, Eleanor Kensington was standing at the window with her back to the room and both hands flat on the sill, and she was breathing like someone who has just carried something heavy up a flight of stairs. Luke went back to the barn. She came down at 9 that night. He was in the aisle with a lamp and a lead rope in his hands and Sovereign's off hind foot between his knees, and she stood at the stall door and watched until he set the foot down. Sole bruised, Luke said. He's been stomping. The flies are bad this week. Otis says you've been sleeping down here. Some nights. There's a bunkhouse. There is, Luke agreed. Eleanor almost smiled. You're not the first man in this valley to prefer horses to men, Mr. Callahan, but you're the first to be polite about it." He wiped his hands. "Who was he?" "The man in the buggy." The almost smile went away. "That," she said, "is not a question an employee asks." "No, ma'am, it isn't." He hung the rope on the hook. "So I'll ask a different one. 3 weeks ago, you sat me in a room with your books and said, 'Bring your own eyes.' I've brought them. Mrs. Finch has been up past midnight since. And this afternoon, a man came here and sat in your front room for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and you came out of that meeting holding onto a windowsill." He turned around. "You can tell me to go muck stalls. That's your right. I'm on your payroll. But don't tell me it's not my business, because you made it my business in July, and I've got a brother sleeping over your tack room on the strength of it." Eleanor was quiet. "His name is Reuben Wicks," she said. "He's an attorney out of Denver. He came to tell me that the Meridian Land and Water Company holds an option to purchase 4 sections of Kensington Valley ground along the East Ditch, exercisable on the 1st of November, at $11 an acre. 4 sections is 2,500 acres, 2,560, at $11, which is about a third of what it's worth, and about a fourth of what it's worth with water on it." Eleanor's voice was flat and steady, and her hands were in her pockets, which Luke had learned meant something. He was very courteous. He said he'd come personally as a professional kindness, so I wouldn't be surprised by a filing. "You never signed any option?" "No." "Then it's forged and it's finished." "That's what I said." Eleanor looked at the stallion. "He said, Miss Kensington, I would never suggest that. And then he took a document out of his case and asked me if I recognized my own signature." Luke waited. "In March of '78, she said, I was 26 years old, and my father had been dead 9 weeks, and there were 300 head to move and a bank in Cheyenne that wouldn't speak to a woman. Nathan Granger had been my father's clerk for 2 years. He sat with me in that office and put a paper in front of me and said, 'This lets me sign for you when you can't be in 2 places.' And I signed it." She took a breath. "It's a general power of attorney. It has no term. I never revoked it because I never once thought about it again in 13 years. The lamp hissed. "So it isn't forged," Luke said. "It's better than forged. It's legal." Her voice cracked on the ladder, just slightly, and she stopped and made it stop. "Every contract that man has signed for 11 years, every note he's bought, every assessment he's paid, every option he's granted, he had my authority in my hand with my name on it." Mr. Wicks was very clear. He said his client would of course consider any reasonable adjustment in the spirit of neighbors. "He was offering you a way out. He was showing me the hole and asking me to climb in politely." She let out a breath. "And the terrible part, Mr. Callahan, is that Reuben Wicks is not a criminal. He's an attorney with a client and a valid instrument. If I stand in a courtroom in Denver and say a woman shouldn't be held to a paper she signed at 26, every man on that bench will nod and rule against me and think kindly of me while he does it. Then revoke it. I did. This afternoon. In writing, filed with the county clerk at 4:50, 10 minutes before he shut." She almost laughed. "Which stops nothing that's already done. It only stops what's next. Does Granger know?" "He will by tomorrow noon." Luke stood there and felt the shape of the thing settle over him. "Then you've got till tomorrow noon," he said. "To do what?" "To take everything out of that office that isn't nailed down and put it somewhere he can't get to it." Luke picked up the lamp. "Ma'am, you just took a man's hand off the throttle after 11 years and you gave him a night's warning. If it was me, I'd be in that office right now." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Get Otis," she said, "and Mrs. Finch, and nobody else." They worked from 10 at night until 3:15 in the morning, 4 of them, carrying 11 years of the Kensington Valley estate out of the office in wooden crates and up the back stairs into a locked storeroom under the eaves, and Ada Finch made a list of every book as it went by, and Otis Pike carried more than any of them and never said one word. At 2 in the morning, Eleanor sat down on a crate in the hall with a ledger open on her knees and stopped moving. "Ma'am?" 1884, she said, "the year I bought the Martian mares. That was the best year this ranch ever had. I remember standing in the yard in November thinking, we've done it, we've come out from under it." She turned a page. "There's $1,100 in this book paid to a freight concern in Laramie that I have never heard of, in 1884. He was already doing it, and I was standing in the yard being proud. Ma'am, Pike said, it ain't your... Otis. She closed the book. Don't. If you tell me it isn't my fault, I'll say something I'll regret, because you have worked in this valley for 26 years, and you knew Corliss, and you knew about the September accounts, and you never came to me either, and neither did Ada, and neither did Ruth Dolan, and there are 61 families on this ground who all decided separately that it was somebody else's business. She stood up. So it's not my fault, it's ours. And I'd rather carry a share of it than be a fool who was tricked, because a fool can't fix anything. Nobody answered that. They kept carrying crates. At 3:30, she stopped Luke at the foot of the stairs. Mr. Callahan, thank you. Ma'am. I want to say one thing to you, and then I'm going to bed. She had straw dust in her hair, and there was ink on the side of her hand. Nathan Granger is going to come after you, not me. Me he'll handle in a courtroom in Denver where he has advantages. You he'll handle here. She looked at him steadily. You have no money, no standing, a public quarrel with him in front of 200 witnesses, a fist fight with one of my own hands, and a wage for me that half this territory already has an ugly explanation for. If a man wanted to build something out of that, he wouldn't have to build much. I know it. Do you? Ma'am, I've known it since the day I shook your hand, Luke said. I got in a wagon with $100 I didn't have, and a name I couldn't defend, and I came here anyway. If it comes, it comes. That's very brave and completely useless. Try again. He thought about it. Then I'd say I've got two things he can't take, Luke said. Everything I've found is in Mrs. Finch's hand, not mine, and every man on this place has watched me work for a month. Better, Eleanor said. Go to bed. It came 9 days later. Otis Pike found the east breeding pasture gate standing open at 10 minutes to 5 in the morning and 6 horses gone out of it. Not the geldings, not the yearlings, Sovereign, and 5 of the Martian mares, the imported line, the foundation of every good thing in that valley. And Sovereign's stall door was hanging open too, which meant somebody had taken him out of a locked barn, put a halter on a stallion that had put a man through a wall in June, and led him 300 yards down a lane in the dark. By 6 o'clock, there were 40 men in that yard. By 7, Sheriff Amos Bowen was there. A heavy, slow man of about 50 with a walrus mustache and a habit of repeating the last 3 words anybody said to him. And standing next to him, having arrived from the freight barn at a fast walk with his coat perfectly brushed, was Nathan Granger. 6 head, Bowen said. 6 head. What's the value? On the mares alone, $12,000, Granger said. The stallion is not replaceable at any price. Sheriff, I want to be very careful here because I have an obligation to this estate, and I also have an obligation not to accuse a man in front of his neighbors. Then don't, Eleanor said. Ma'am, with respect, I'd like you to hear the facts as I have them, and then instruct me. I'll hear them. Luke was standing at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hand, and he already knew. He'd known since Pike shook him awake. He watched it come the way a man on a road watches weather come. The stallion barn was locked, Granger said. 3 keys. Mr. Pike, myself, and, since the first week of August, at Miss Kensington's own instruction, Mr. Callahan. The yard shifted. There's a lead rope on the gatepost out there, Mr. Pike. Is that a valley rope? Pike's jaw worked. It's got a blue whipping on the end. Whose ropes have blue whipping, Mr. Pike? Mine and his. And where's yours? On my saddle. Sheriff, Granger said, I'd also tell you that Mr. Callahan is the only man on this place that stallion will follow out of a stall, which is not a suspicion, it's simply a fact that 40 men will swear to. And I tell you that he came into this valley 11 weeks ago out of a foreclosure at Prosper Bend owing this estate $360, and that he has, in that time, been given the run of the office, the barns, and the books. Run of the books, Bowen repeated. And I'd tell you, Granger said, and here he turned slightly so that he was speaking to the crowd and not to the sheriff at all, that 8 days ago Miss Kensington filed a revocation of my authority at the county seat without speaking to me first, and that I have not said one word of complaint about it to any man here, because I assumed she had her reasons. He paused exactly long enough. I did not assume they were his. It was very well done. Luke stood there and felt about 40 men rearrange themselves around him. That's a lie, Toby said. He was up on the fence rail, 14 years old, white to the lips. That's a lie, and you know it's a... Toby. Luke didn't raise his voice. Get down. But he... Get down. The boy got down. Sheriff Bowen turned around. Yes, sir, Luke said. I want to say I didn't take them, and I want to say I can't prove it standing here, and I want to say that the 6 most valuable animals on this place went missing 8 days after Miss Kensington took a man's power of attorney away from him, and I'd ask you to write that down next to the part about my rope. Bowen's mustache moved. Next to the rope. Sheriff, that's an accusation against a man of standing, Granger began. It's an observation, Luke said, and you just made about 9 of them. Enough. Eleanor's voice cut across the yard. Sheriff? What do you need? Bowen scratched under his hat. Ma'am, I got 6 head gone and 1 man with a key and a rope, and I got a valley full of people. If I don't take 'em in, half this county says you bought me. If I do take 'em in, and they're found in a canyon in 3 days, I look like a fool who locked up the only man who could track them. He sighed. How much law you want, Miss Kensington? And Eleanor Kensington did not answer for 4 full seconds. Luke would carry those 4 seconds for a long while. He watched her look at him, really look, the way she'd looked at the stallion's legs in the corral at Prosper Bend, checking, weighing, adding. And he watched a doubt go across her face. Not a big one, not enough that anybody else in that yard would have caught it, but it was there, and he saw it, and something in his chest went cold and quiet, because she was not a fool. She had known him 11 weeks. And a woman who has just found out that 11 years of her life was a lie does not get to be certain about anything ever again. I want 2 days, she said. Ma'am? 2 days. He rides out this morning to look for them with Mr. Pike and Mr. Dolan and any man here who volunteers, and you can send a deputy along to sit on him if it makes the county comfortable. Her chin came up. And if in 2 days he hasn't brought them back or shown me something, I'll hand him to you myself in this yard in front of every one of these people. Nathan Granger inclined his head. That's very fair. It wasn't for you, Eleanor said. They cut for sign at the gate, and it was bad from the first minute. 6 head had gone out and been walked, not driven, 300 yards down the lane onto the gravel of the county road. And the county road had been used by 4 freight wagons and a stage since midnight. That's a horseman, Pike said. That's a man who knows this country. He didn't run 'em, he didn't scatter 'em, he took 'em out on rock. Roof Dolan spat. That's 12 miles of gravel before you get anything soft. Then we'll ride 12 miles of gravel, Luke said. There were 9 of them by 9 o'clock. Luke, Pike, Roof, 4 hands who'd volunteered without much enthusiasm. A young deputy named Coyle, who looked about 19 and miserable, and Toby, who had saddled a pony and fallen in behind and did not respond to any suggestion that he go back. They rode the gravel to the fork and lost it. They rode north to the Halverson line and found nothing and lost 4 hours. At 2 in the afternoon, Roof Dolan said what everybody was thinking, which was that a man who wanted horses gone would put them on a stock car at Laramie by Thursday, and there was no finding them after that. At 3, one of the hands turned back. At 4, another one did. They camped on the flat above Culver's Draw, and nobody talked much, and Deputy Coyle sat with his back to a rock trying to look like a man on duty. Luke didn't sleep. He sat up with a lamp and a piece of paper and worked, and at some point Toby came and sat down next to him. You're drawing. I'm thinking. That's a shoe. That's Sovereign's off for. Luke turned the paper. He's got a rolled toe on that foot because he forges. Only horse in the valley shod that way. And Elias Boone shot him 14 days ago, and I stood there and watched him do it. He tapped the drawing. So I'm not looking for 6 horses. I'm looking for 1 print, once, anywhere in 40 miles. That's worse. That's better, Luke said. 6 horses is a crowd. 1 print's a fact. Toby was quiet for a while. She hesitated, he said. Yeah. In the yard, when the sheriff asked, I saw it. I know. Don't it make you... No. Luke said, and found as he said it that it was mostly true. No, it doesn't. Toby, that woman found out 9 days ago that a man she trusted for 11 years has been robbing her since before you were born. If she'd looked at me in that yard and been certain, I'd have thought she was a fool, and I'd have been right. He folded the paper. She gave me 2 days. That's not doubt. That's what trust looks like on a bad morning. Toby chewed on that. That's a real grown-up answer, he said. It took me all day to build it. Sounds like it. They found the print at 8:20 the next morning, 4.5 miles up a rock draw that nobody had suggested and Luke had picked for one reason. It ran toward nothing. It was half a print, in a patch of silt the size of a saddle blanket where a seep had come out of the wall, and it had a rolled toe. Pike got down off the roan and squatted over it for a long time. "Well," he said. "Hell." "That's north," Roof said. "There ain't a thing north but the Delphi." "What's the Delphi?" "Mine," Pike said, standing up. "Silver. Went bust in '83. There's a whole camp up there rotting. Stamp mill, bunkhouses, corrals big enough to hold 300 mules, and a road built to haul ore out that don't show on the county map because the county never paid for it." He looked at Luke. "And it's about 9 miles from here, and the only man in this valley who ever mentioned it to me is Nathan Granger, who took me up there in '86 and said we ought to buy the timber off it." Deputy Coyle stood up. "I'd like the record to show," he said, in the voice of a boy who has practiced a sentence, "that I've been present for the whole of this." "Write it down then," Pike said. "Write down where we are and what time it is and what that print's got on the toe." They came up on the Delphi at 1:30, and they came the hard way, up the back of the ridge on foot with the horses left below, because Luke had said so and Pike had backed him. From the lip of the ridge you could see the whole camp, the collapsed mill, the black mouth of the adit, 2 rows of bunkhouses with the roofs going, and at the bottom of the basin a set of pole corrals that were not falling down at all. The poles were new. The wire on the gate was bright. There were 6 horses in them. Roof Dolan made a sound like he'd been hit. Sovereign was standing in the far corner with his head over the top rail, and even at 400 yards you could see he'd been standing that way a long time. "There's your 2 men," Pike said. "Fire's lit. That's a coffee pot." "There's 3, Luke said. "One's asleep under the wagon." There was a wagon. There was also, off to the side by the old blacksmith shop, a small iron brazier and a stack of something on a flat rock beside it that took Luke a moment to make out and then made his stomach turn over. "Otis, what's on that rock?" Pike shaded his eyes. "Irons," he said. "How many?" 4, 5. There's a bar iron and there's... He stopped. "There's a running iron." Roof swore. "They ain't stealing horses," Pike said slowly. "You don't steal a registered Martian mare. Every buyer from here to Kansas City knows those hips. You can't sell her, you can't even give her away." "No," Luke said. "You alter her, and then you don't sell her to anybody. You find her." He was talking half to himself, working it as it came. "Otis, if those 6 turn up in 90 days on some ditch company's ground in the next county, wearing a blotched brand, and the estate's already written them off as stolen, who owns them?" "Whoever's got 'em, and a bill of sale." "And who writes the bill of sale?" Pike's face went a color Luke hadn't seen on it before. "A man with a power of attorney," he said, "signing for the estate, selling estate stock to himself, dated any day he likes, because he's the one that keeps the book." "Except the power got revoked 8 days ago," Luke said. "Which is why they're in a corral instead of on a stock car," Pike said. "He's been building this since spring, and she pulled the floor out from under him 9 days before he was ready." Deputy Coyle had gone gray. "Mister, that's not just a horse theft. That's forgery and false pretenses, and I have got about 2 years of experience, and I would very much like to go get the sheriff." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Luke said. Roof Dolan turned around. "The hell it is. There's 3 of them and 6 of us, and I got a rifle. And they've got our horses in a pen in about 11 seconds to shoot every one of them if it goes wrong," Luke said. "Roof, look at me. That stallion's worth more than this whole ridge, and he's standing 30 feet from a man with a gun. We go down there hot, and somebody panics, and then Miss Kensington's got 6 dead horses and a shooting on her ground, and a lawyer in Denver telling a judge her hired hand started a gunfight over stock he'd stolen himself. So we sit here." "No." Luke slid back off the lip of the ridge. "We work." They worked for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and it was the least dramatic thing any of those men had ever done in their lives, and it was the thing that won it. Deputy Coyle wrote, in a pocketbook, the date, the hour, the position of the sun, the location by section and range as Pike gave it to him, the number and description of 6 head including markings, the presence of new pole corrals and bright wire, the presence of a brazier and 5 irons of which one was a running iron, and the presence of 3 men, one of whom he could describe by the color of his coat. Pike went down the backside alone and came up an hour later with a feed sack he had taken out of the wagon bed while all three men were at the fire, and the sack was stenciled Wallendorf and Kotel Laramie and had a freight tag wired to the corner of it with a number on it and a date. Roof Dolan, who could not read past his own name, walked the entire rim of that basin and came back and drew in the dirt every trail in and out of it with his finger. And there were 4, and he could tell you where 3 of them came out. And Luke lay on his belly at the lip of the ridge for 2 hours with the drawing of a horseshoe in his hand and watched a man in a gray coat go 3 separate times to the corral fence and stand and look at Sovereign and go away again without touching him. He's scared of him, Luke said. Wouldn't you be? He's the one that let him out. Luke handed the field glasses back to Pike. Whoever walked a stud horse 300 yards down a lane in the dark walked him with a chain over his nose, and he's been terrified of him ever since. Look at how he stands. That's a man who got away with something once and won't try it twice. So that horse hasn't been handled in 2 days, and he hasn't been fed anything but grass, hay, and there's no water bucket in that corner. They're not tending them, Otis. They're warehousing them. Luke got up. And that means somebody's coming to move them soon, and probably at night. They rode into the valley at 9 that evening, in the dark, and the yard was full of lanterns because nobody had gone to bed. Eleanor came off the porch fast and stopped herself 4 steps out and put her hands in her pockets. Well? Delphi Mine Basin, Luke said, getting down. Section 11, North Range. 6 head, alive, all standing. New corals, new wire, 3 men, a wagon, and a brazier with 5 irons on a rock, and one of them's a running iron. He handed her the feed sack. That came out of the wagon. Otis took it. Deputy Coyle's got every bit of it written down in his own hand, and he'll swear to all of it, and Roof's got the trails mapped. Eleanor held the sack up to the lantern and read the stencil and the tag, and the whole yard watched her do it. Wallendorf, she said. You know it? It's a freight concern in Laramie. Her voice was very level. It's in the 1884 ledger. $1,100. She stood there in the lantern light with a feed sack in her hands. Then she said, Sheriff Bowen went home at 6. Somebody wake up a rider. Ma'am. Otis Pike stepped in close and his voice dropped. Before you send anybody anywhere, there's a thing you gotta hear and you ain't gonna like where I stand on it. Say it. Granger's been in that freight office all day. Pike's jaw was tight. And at 4 o'clock this afternoon, he sent Pruitt to Cheyenne on the evening stage with 2 trunks. 2 trunks. Pruitt didn't come back for his supper, and his room's cleared out. Eleanor didn't move. And there's more, Pike said, and it's mine to carry. He come to the barns about noon and asked me, casual as you please, whether we'd searched north yet. Not east, not the rail, north. He looked at the ground. Ma'am, I've worked with that man 11 years, and I answered him. I said we hadn't, but Callahan was working the draws. And then I stood there for about half a minute, feeling like a man who's just handed somebody a loaded gun and can't remember why. The yard was dead silent. Otis, Eleanor said, how long would it take a rider from here to reach that basin? 4 hours. 3 if you killed the horse. And he asked you at noon. He asked me at noon. Eleanor turned around and looked at the 60-odd people standing in her yard. Hands, cooks, wives, children up past bedtime. Ada Finch on the porch with a shawl over her nightdress. Roof Dolan still holding his reins. Toby Callahan asleep on his feet against a wagon wheel. And she made the decision that everybody in 3 counties would still be arguing about at Christmas. Mrs. Finch, she said, fetch a lamp and paper. You'll write and I'll sign. Yes, ma'am. First, as of this hour, every man holding a position of authority in the management of this estate is suspended from his duties. That is Mr. Granger, that is the freight office, that is the accounts, that is the purchasing, and that is me. The sound the yard made was like a wind coming through. Ma'am, Pike started. All of us, Otis, including you and including me, because if I stand up here and suspend everybody but myself, then every word out of my mouth for the next 6 months is worth exactly nothing. Eleanor's voice carried and did not shake. Second, Mrs. Finch, in the morning you will send 3 wires, 1 to Faulkner and Hoyt, attorneys, Denver, not Wicks, and not anybody Wicks has ever taken a meal with. 1 to a firm of public accountants, and I don't care what they cost, and I want men who have never set foot in this territory. And 1 to the Territorial Stock Growers Association, requesting a brand inspector, by name, immediately, and tell them why. Ada Finch's pen had stopped. Miss Eleanor, if you send that third wire, it's in every stock paper in the West inside a week. I know it. They'll say the valley's rotten. The valley is rotten. Ma'am, my father is dead, Eleanor said, and he left me a power of attorney and a lot of good advice about keeping things in the family, and I have followed both for 13 years, and it has cost me $11,000 a year, and a man's whole reputation, and very nearly a horse. She took the pen out of Ada Finch's hand and held it a moment. Every buyer I have will slow down. Every bank will look twice. There are 3 men in this territory who have waited a long time to hear that Kensington Valley is in trouble, and by Friday they'll be drinking to it in Cheyenne. She handed the pen back. Write it anyway. Nobody moved. Third, Eleanor said, Sheriff Bowen will have a rider tonight, and he'll be at the Delphi at first light with as many men as he can swear in, and Mr. Callahan and Mr. Pike and Mr. Dolan will guide him. Deputy Coyle, are you fit to ride again? Coyle straightened up so fast he nearly fell over. Yes, ma'am. Fourth, she turned. Mr. Callahan. Ma'am. 26 hours ago I stood in this yard and I gave you 2 days, and there was a moment before I said it when I did not know. She said it out loud to all of them, and she did not soften it. I want that on the record with everything else, because I'm asking these people to be honest about 11 years, and I'd be a hypocrite to start it by pretending about yesterday morning. Luke's throat was tight, and he had absolutely nothing to say. So, Eleanor said, get your supper. You leave at 3. The yard broke up slowly. Lanterns went off toward the bunkhouses in 1s and 2s, and somebody carried Toby to bed, and Ada Finch went in to write, and out in the dark a rider went down the lane at a hard gallop toward the county seat. Otis Pike stood a while by the porch step with his hat in his hands. Ma'am, he said, about what I told him at noon. Otis, I'd like to say I didn't know what I was doing. You didn't. That's the part that's going to keep me up, he said. Up in the freight barn office, the lamp had not been lit all evening, and the drawer where Nathan Granger kept his letter book was standing open and empty, and on the desk, squared neatly to the edge, was a single sheet of paper with nothing written on it, but a section number, a range, and the word North. And it had been sitting there since noon, in a room with an unlocked door, in a valley where 61 people were awake and looking for 6 horses. They left at 3 in the morning with the lamps hooded, 11 men and a boy who had been told twice to stay and had gotten on his pony anyway, and Sheriff Amos Bowen rode at the head of them with his coat buttoned wrong because he had been asleep 40 minutes earlier. Section 11, Bowen said. Section 11. And you've had eyes on it since when? 1:30 yesterday afternoon, Luke said. And you didn't take them then. There were 3 men and a fire and 6 horses in a pen. If we'd gone down that hill, somebody'd have got scared, and scared men shoot at what's closest, and what's closest was Miss Kensington's stud horse. Luke kept his eyes on the road. I'd rather explain a day's delay to you than explain a dead stallion to her. Bowen chewed on that for about a mile. That's the right answer, he said. That's the right answer, and it's the first time in 9 years a man's give me 1 at 3 in the morning. The sky went gray behind the ridge at 4:45, and they left the horses in the timber below the rim and came up on foot, and Otis Pike got to the lip first and stopped so suddenly that Rufe Dolan walked into the back of him. The corral was empty. Nobody said anything for a moment. The poles stood there in the half-light with the bright wire still on the gate, and the gate was open, and there was nothing in that basin but a wagon with no team and a fire that had burned down to a gray heap. Rufe Dolan sat down on a rock and put his hands over his face. Luke went down the slope at a run. The fire was warm, not hot. Warm, the kind of warm a fire is 4 or 5 hours after the last stick goes on it, and the coffee pot was on its side in the ash, and there was a boot print through the middle of the coals where somebody had walked straight over the fire in the dark because he was in too much of a hurry to go around. Midnight, Pike said, coming up behind him. Give or take. He got word. He got word. Otis, don't. I told him north at noon, Pike said. I've had all night to add it up, and it adds the same every time. Then it adds wrong. Luke straightened. He didn't need you. There was a paper on his desk with the section number written on it, and he left it there for anybody to see. And he sent Prewitt to Cheyenne with 2 trunks at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's not a man who found something out at noon. That's a man who'd already decided by breakfast. They found the 3rd man in the blacksmith shop, and he was not asleep, and he was not armed. He was sitting on the dirt floor with his back to the cold forge and his left boot off, and his ankle swollen up the size of a melon. And when 11 men came through the door with rifles, he put both hands up so fast he cracked his elbow on the stone. "Don't," he said. Don't. "Name," Bowen said. "Ort Bell." "Ort Bell." Bowen crouched down. "Where's the stock, Ort?" "I don't know nothing about no stock." "You're sitting in a mine camp with a busted ankle and a running iron on a rock outside. Try again." "I ain't sitting in it. I got left in it." Bell's voice went up. "They pulled out at midnight, and Cordell says, 'Get in the wagon,' and I says, 'I can't get in the wagon,' and he says, 'Then you'll walk,' and they went. 4 hours ago. I've been hollering at a mountain since." Luke crouched down on the other side of him. "Cordell," he said. "Cordell Mabry." "That's a name off a payroll sheet," Luke said. "Cordell M. $30 a month out of the general account since '86. Ort Bell looked at him, and his mouth came open. "How'd you know that?" "Where'd they take them?" "Mister, I got a wife in Greeley." "Ort." Bowen put a hand on his shoulder, not hard. "Look at me. Right now there's 6 head of registered stock gone off this mountain, and a woman in that valley who's out $12,000, and there's exactly 1 man sitting in front of me. Every hour that goes by, more of this belongs to you. You understand what I'm telling you?" Ort Bell started to cry, which nobody in that room enjoyed. "Sadler's Spur," he said. "There's a loading chute at Sadler's. Cordell's got a stock car coming down from Laramie on the 640 and a bill of lading with a name on it that ain't his." "That's 18 miles, Pike said. "It's 14 on the ore road," Roof Dolan said. He was already up. "I walked that rim yesterday and drawed it in the dirt for the deputy. The ore road comes off the back of this basin and runs down Kettle Draw and hits the flat about a mile above the spur. It ain't on the county map because the mine built it." Bowen was on his feet. "How long ago's 640? "It's 10 past 5, Pike said. "Then we've got 90 minutes and we're 14 miles out." 12 for us, Roof said. "There's a cut over the shoulder a wagon can't take and a horse can." Bowen looked at Luke. Luke looked at Roof Dolan, who 3 weeks earlier had been sitting in the dirt with blood on his teeth. "You lead," Luke said. They came off the shoulder above Sadler's Spur at 11 minutes past 6, with the horses lathered and blowing and Deputy Coyle's hat gone somewhere on the mountain, and below them in the gray flat by the siding. There was a wagon, a pole chute, 5 horses in a wing pen, and a great deal of shouting. The 6th horse was not in the pen. Sovereign was standing at the foot of the chute with his hind feet planted and 3 men on a rope, and a 4th man was behind him with a length of wagon tongue, and the stallion was down on his knees in the dirt and coming back up and down again, and there was blood on the boards. Luke heard a sound come out of Otis Pike that he'd never heard a grown man make. "That's it," Roof said, working his rifle. "That's the end of my patience." "Roof, don't you roof me. There's 5 head in that pen and a rail line behind them, and if you fire that thing, they will go through the wire and onto the track, and it'll take a week to gather what's left." Luke was already off his horse. "Sheriff, how much law do you want?" Bowen looked down the slope, and his big, slow face was not slow at all. "All of it," he said. "Coyle, you ride around the far side and put yourself between them and that wagon. Pike, take 4 men down the road slow and loud. I want them looking at you." He looked at Luke. "And what in the hell are you doing?" "Walking down there?" "Son, there's 4 of them." "They're not going to shoot me," Luke said. "They're going to be busy." He handed his reins to Toby, who had come up the mountain behind them all and had the good sense not to say one word. And then Luke Callahan walked down a bare slope toward 4 men and a rail siding with nothing in his hands at all. I was about 80 yards out when the one with the wagon tongue saw him and shouted, and the rope crew turned, and the man in the gray coat, Cordell Mabry, 45 and thin as a rasp, put his hand inside his coat and left it there. Luke didn't stop and didn't hurry. "Morning," he said. "That's far enough." "It isn't." Luke kept coming. "You've got a stud horse down on his knees 11 minutes before a train, and I'll tell you for free, he will die on those boards before he walks up that chute for you, because you have taught him for 2 days that men come at his head with iron. Now you can shoot me. There's a sheriff on that hill and a deputy behind your wagon and about 9 witnesses, and you can shoot me and hang, or you can drop that rope and step back and let me put him where you want him." Mabry's eyes went up the slope. Otis Pike was coming down the road at a walk with 4 men strung out behind him, taking his time about it, making a great deal of noise. "You'd load him for me," Mabry said. I'd load him because in about 4 minutes he's going to break a leg on that chute, and then he's dead whichever way this ends. And I've had my hands on that horse every day for 11 weeks. Luke stopped 10 feet away. Drop the rope. Cordell, one of the crew said. Cordell, there's a badge in the brush. Mabry stood there with his hand inside his coat. Then he took it out, empty, and said, drop it. They dropped the ropes and backed off, and Luke walked past 4 men who had every reason to hurt him and did not once look at any of them. Sovereign was up on his feet, shaking, with the whites showing all the way around and a rope burn across his pole and his near hind cut open on the chute boards. Luke crouched down about 6 feet in front of him and stayed there and started talking about absolutely nothing. About a hog farmer named Cyrus Pell, about a wagon axle, about the price of nails, and the horse stood in the dirt with his sides going like a bellows. It took 4 minutes. It felt like an hour to every man on that hillside. When Luke finally stood and put a hand flat on the stallion's shoulder and walked him, just walked him, 20 feet, away from the chute and out into the open flat. Roof Dolan up on the slope said, quietly, to nobody, well, I'll be damned. Bowen took all 4 of them without a shot fired, and the 640 out of Laramie went through Sadler's Spur at 6:51 with an empty stock car in it and did not slow down. It was the mare that changed everything. Otis Pike found her in the wing pen at the end, a heavy bay Marchand mare of 11 years named Ivy on the stud book, and the crooked one by everybody who had ever worked her, and he stood looking at her left hip for a long time, and then called for the sheriff in a voice that carried a quarter mile. She had been branded in the night, fresh, hours old, the hair burned back, the edges still weeping. Somebody had run a hot iron over the top of the Kensington mark and turned it into something else, badly, the way a man works fast in the dark by lantern light. That's a K under a box, Bowen said. That's a K under a box, plain as a barn door. They'd have had 90 days for it to heal and hair over, Pike said. His voice was thick. 90 days and it's a blotch, and nobody on earth can read it. Well, it's been about 9 hours, Bowen said, and I can read it fine, and so will a judge. Deputy Coyle wrote down the date, the hour, the location by section and range, and the description of the burn, and then, because he was 19 years old and doing the best work of his life, he asked Luke to make him a drawing of it in the book while they stood there. They came into the valley at 4 that afternoon, 6 head walking, and there was nobody in the lane at first, and then there was everybody. Ada Finch came off the porch without her shawl. The cookhouse emptied. Children came out of the schoolroom in a stream and got hollered at and did not stop. Somebody rang the triangle by the bunkhouse for a solid minute for no reason at all. Eleanor Kensington came out of the house and down the steps and stopped at the bottom, and when Otis Pike led Ivy past her, she reached out and put her hand on the mare's neck and walked with her about 10 steps and did not say anything to anybody. Then she saw the hip. She stood absolutely still. "Ma'am," Pike said, "it's fresh. That's the—" "I can see what it is, Otis." Her voice was steady, and her hand on the mare's neck was not. "Get Sowerby down here for that, and for the stud's hind leg. And send someone to tell Mrs. Dolan that her husband is going to be very late for supper and that it is entirely his own doing." Roof Dolan, 20 feet away, turned red to the ears. Faulkner and Hoyt sent 2 men out from Denver on Tuesday. The public accountants came Thursday, 3 of them, from St. Louis, in identical black coats, and the oldest was a bald man named Meacham, who shook hands with nobody and asked for the ledgers before he asked for water. And on Friday morning, the Territorial Stock Growers Association sent Inspector Vance Stiles, who was 64 years old, had been reading brands since 1861, and had a glass eye that he did not explain to anybody. He looked at Ivy's hip for 11 minutes without speaking. "Well," Bowen said. "That's the worst piece of work I've seen in this territory in 6 years, Stiles said. "Man was in a hurry and he was scared and he ran it too hot." He straightened up. "Miss Kensington, I'd like your permission to take a hide tracing, and I'd like this mare kept off feed lots and out of sight for 90 days, and I'd like somebody to write down that I looked at her today, because in 3 months this hip is going to be a smear, and my testimony is going to be all you've got." "Mr. Coyle already has it written," Eleanor said, "in his own hand from the morning it was done." Stiles looked over at the young deputy, who was standing at the fence trying to look like a man who had not been awake for 2 days. "Son," Stiles said, "who taught you to keep a book like that?" "Nobody, sir," Coyle said. "There was a fella on that ridge told me to write down where we were and what time it was and what the shoe had on the toe, so I done that, and then I just kept on." Prewitt came back Saturday. He came in on the noon stage at Prosper Bend and hired a boy with a wagon to bring him the last 11 miles. And he arrived at the north gate with 2 trunks and a face the color of dishwater. And when Otis Pike came out to meet him, he got down and said, "I'd like to see Miss Kensington, and I'd like the sheriff there, and I'd like it in front of a lawyer. And I'd like to say now, before anything, that I am not going to ask for a thing." They put him in the office with Eleanor Bowen, one of the Denver men, Ada Finch to write, and because Prewitt asked for him and would not say why, Luke. "Mr. Prewitt," the Denver lawyer said, "you understand you may be charged." "I will be charged," Prewitt said. "That's the whole of what I've been thinking about for 9 days on a train." He opened the first trunk. "It's all in my hand. Every bit of it. That's what I came to say, and I'd rather say it before you find it." The trunks held 11 years of letter books, press copies, canceled drafts, freight tags, 3 ledgers that had never been in that office, and a bound file of correspondence with the Wallendorf freight concern in Laramie going back to 1884. "He kept it," Bowen said. "Why in hell would a man keep it?" "Because he never once believed he'd have to run," Prewitt said, "and because he needed it. Every one of those instruments has my writing on it. Not his, mine." He sat down without being asked, which he had never done in that room in his life. "That's why he hired me, Miss Kensington. I was 23 and I wrote a good hand and I had a sick mother in Ohio, and he paid me $40 a month when the going rate was 22. I thought he'd seen something in me." "He had," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. He'd seen a man who'd be holding the bag." Prewitt's hands were shaking on his knees. 11 days ago, he told me to write to my sister's husband in Laramie, the one that handles the stock cars. And I sat down with the pen and I thought, if I write this letter, then when it comes apart, it'll be my hand on the freight and my sister's husband on the receiving end and my name on every contract for 11 years. And Mr. Granger will stand up in a courtroom in that coat and say he trusted his clerk too far. He looked up. So I put the pen down and I got the trunks. Nobody spoke for a moment. "Mr. Prewitt," Eleanor said, "the 22nd of last month." Prewitt closed his eyes. "The assignment of the Callahan note was executed on the 2nd, he said, "not the 22nd. I wrote the instrument on the 2nd of that month and Mr. Voss signed it in his own office. And Mr. Granger paid him $460 in gold and 100 more besides that, never went on any bank book." He turned to Luke and could not manage to look at him. "Your father was alive. He had 8 days. I put the 2nd on it and Mr. Granger told me to change it, and I changed it, and that is the single worst thing I have ever done, and I have done a great many." Luke sat there with his hands flat on his knees and did not trust himself to speak. "Why?" Ada Finch said. Her pen had stopped. "Why on earth did it matter to him? 8 days." "Because of the water," Prewitt said. "It took Meacham and his 2 men 9 days to build it, and when they were done, they laid it out on the long table in the estate office with the windows open and a wind coming through, and it was the plainest thing anybody in that valley had ever seen. Meridian Land and Water Company, chartered in Denver in the spring of 1885. 400 shares, 160 held by Reuben Wicks, attorney of Denver, 80 held by Harlan Voss of Prosper Bend, paid for out of what Meacham described flatly as bank money that had gone out one door and come back through another. 60 held by a Chicago concern that Meacham said would take a year in a lawsuit to unwrap, and 100 held in the name of Granger Land and Livestock Co., which was Nathan Granger and a rented desk. And the whole company had exactly one asset that mattered, a ditch line surveyed to run 22 miles along the East Flat, capable of watering better than 9,000 acres of ground that was worth $11 an acre dry and 45 with water on it. "It's a fine plan," Meacham said. "It's about the finest plan I've audited in 30 years, and I'll tell you why. It cost them almost nothing. The surveys were paid by this estate under the heading of water assessments. The freight was paid by this estate. The camp at the Delphi was built with this estate's poles and this estate's wire, hauled by this estate's teams, and 3 of the 4 men working it drew wages off this estate's payroll under names Mrs. Finch was told were seasonal hands." He tapped the paper. "The Kensington Valley estate has spent 5 years and about $47,000 building the instrument of its own purchase." "And the option," Eleanor said. "The option is the harvest, ma'am. 2,560 acres at $11 is $28,160, payable the 1st of November. That same ground under ditch sells at 45, which is 115,000. Meacham looked up. And that's 4 sections. There's a second option drafted but not executed for 11 more. Had that gone through, this ranch would have been bought out from under you, with your own money, over about 4 years, and every dollar of it legal on the face of the paper. The room was silent. There's one thing wrong with it, Luke said. Meacham turned. Go ahead. A ditch has to start somewhere. Luke stood up and went to the survey and put his finger on the head of the line, 22 miles east, at a section number he had known since he was 9 years old. That's my creek. That creek's dry, one of the Denver men said. I drove past it. The creek's dry. The spring's not. Luke's voice was low. There's live water under that bank, and it has never once quit, not in 11 months. And my father knew it, and he dug his well right on top of it. In 86 and half, this county laughed at him for digging in a bad place. He looked around the table. Without that spring, that ditch is a trench with nothing in it. There's no other source on that flat in a drought year. Not one. So he needed the Callahan section, Meacham said. He needed it, and my father wouldn't sell it. He told him so in front of witnesses 8 months ago in our own front room, and I never knew about it because Pa was already sick and he didn't want me carrying it. Luke's hand was flat on the map. And when Pa got sick enough that it was a matter of weeks, Granger went to the bank and bought the note on the second, while he was still breathing, so that the minute he stopped there'd be a demand due and a boy of 28 standing there with nothing, Eleanor said very quietly. And he'd have had it too, for $200 and 40 acres of dry ground. He'd have had it, Luke said. He was 4 hours from having it. Ada Finch said, and then a woman drove into that trading post to look at a horse. Nobody answered her. Nathan Granger did not run. That was the thing that nobody had counted on, and it very nearly worked, because on the second Monday of October, a notice went up on the door of the Grange Hall at Prosper Bend and on the wall of the feed store and in the window of the Cattlemen's Trust, calling a meeting of the creditors, neighbors, and employees of the Kensington Valley estate to consider a petition. The petition asked the probate court of the county to appoint a conservator over the affairs of Eleanor Kensington on the grounds that she had, within the space of 1 month, suspended her entire management, dismissed her attorneys, invited public accountants and a territorial brand inspector onto her ground, and thereby destroyed the credit of an operation on which 61 families depended. It had 31 signatures on it when it went up. 31, Otis Pike said. Ma'am, I know 19 of them. They ain't bad men. No, Eleanor said. They're frightened men who've been told a story by somebody they've trusted for 11 years. That's not the same as bad, and I'd rather you didn't confuse them, because we're going to need them in that room. The hall was full an hour before the meeting. There were men standing in the aisles and along the back wall and out on the steps with the door open so they could hear, and it was the largest gathering anybody in Prosper Bend could remember that wasn't a funeral. Nathan Granger stood up in a good coat and spoke for 19 minutes without a note, and he was very good. He did not attack her. That was the craft of it. He praised her courage, her devotion, the impossible weight put on a young woman at 26. And he grieved openly that the strain of 13 years had finally told. He spoke about the wire to the Stock Growers Association and what it had already done. 2 buyers slowed, 1 bank in Cheyenne asking questions, a hay contract canceled. He spoke about the 61 families. He said the word families 11 times, and Luke, standing at the back with his hat in his hands, counted every one of them. And I'll say the hard part, Granger said, because nobody else will. There is a young man in this county who came out of a foreclosure 11 weeks ago owing this estate $360, who has since been given the run of her barns, her books, and her house, and whose wage was set in a public yard in front of 200 of you in a manner that I will not characterize because there are ladies present. He let the murmur come and go. I don't say he's a criminal. I say he's 28 years old and lucky, and he has whispered into the ear of a tired woman, and she has burned down 11 years of careful management on his word. That's all I say. He sat down to a silence that was not comfortable and was not on his side either, and that was the exact moment the whole county tipped one way or the other. Eleanor Kensington stood up. I'll be brief, she said, and I won't ask you to take my word for anything, because Mr. Granger's right about one thing. I've been wrong for 11 years, and there's no reason you should trust my judgment now. So I'm not going to give you my judgment. I'm going to give you documents, and I'm going to give you 3 people who aren't me. She nodded, and Otis Pike opened the double doors at the back of the hall. He led Ivy up the steps and into the room. There was a sound like a wave. Men stood up. Somebody's chair went over. "This is a Marchand mare, 11 years old, taken off my ground on the night of the 26th, Eleanor said. "Mr. Stiles, would you tell them what's on her hip?" Vance Stiles walked over and did not touch the mare, and did not raise his voice. "Somebody run a hot iron over a Kensington K on the night of the 26th of September, in bad light," he said. "He tried to make it a box. He ran it too hot, and he pulled it, and that scar will be unreadable in 90 days, and it is not unreadable today. I've been reading brands for 28 years, and I'll swear to that hip in any court in this territory, and so will the deputy who wrote it down and drew it the morning it was found." He stepped back. "Mr. Pruitt," Eleanor said. Pruitt stood up, and about 40 men in that hall recognized him, and the noise changed. He was shaking badly. He read from a paper because he could not have done it otherwise, and he read for 22 minutes. The letter books, the freight tags, the payroll names, the auction returns, the hay contract that was 210 tons on paper and oat straw in the mow, the assignment of the Callahan note executed on the 2nd and dated the 22nd. At the second, a man near the front stood up. It was Harlan Voss, and he had come because not coming would have looked worse, and he said, "That's a lie," in a voice that broke on the second word. "Mr. Voss," Pruitt said without looking up, "you signed it at your own desk at about 4 in the afternoon, and you asked me twice whether the date mattered, and I told you Mr. Granger said it didn't." He turned the page. "You hold 80 shares of the Meridian Land and Water Company. They're recorded in Denver. I wrote the transfer." Harlan Voss sat down and did not get up again. Meacham read the audit. He read it the way a man reads a feed bill, in a dry, flat voice, for 31 minutes, and he named the figure 4 times because he had been asked to. $47,280 taken out of the Kensington Valley estate between 1884 and 1889 by embezzlement, false payroll, forged contract, and fraudulent auction return, and a further $115,000 in ground standing to be taken on the 1st of November under an option granted by a power of attorney that Eleanor Kensington had signed at 26 years old and never thought about again. When he was done, Eleanor said, "Mr. Callahan." Luke came up the aisle and did not want to and went anyway. He was not good at it. He said so afterward, and everybody who was there agreed, and it did not matter one bit, because what he did was hold up a survey map and put his finger on the head of a ditch and say, "That's my father's spring. That's the whole thing. Every acre on that map is worth $11 without it and $45 with it, and my father wouldn't sell it, and he was told he'd regret that, and 8 days later a note was bought on his deathbed." His voice went. He stopped and got it back and finished. "I'm the one who found it. Miss Kensington didn't tell me what to find. She sat me in a room with 11 years of books and a woman who's kept them honest for 5, and she said, 'Bring your own eyes and leave your opinions at the door.' And I did, and this is what was in there. That's not a tired woman being whispered to. That is the only person in this territory who ever let anybody look." He sat down. Rufe Dolan stood up at the back of the hall. "I got a thing to say, and then I'll shut up," he said. "I've been on that payroll 9 years. 4 years running, I asked for $2, and 4 years running. That man sat me down and explained the September accounts to me like I was a child, and I went home and told my wife next year. He was not looking at Granger. He was looking at the 31 men whose names were on the petition, and about half of them were looking at the floor. Boys, I know 11 of you signed that paper, and I know why. You signed it because he's been telling us all what to think since before some of us was married. Well, he told me what to think for 9 years, and it cost me $8 a month and my wife's patience, and I ain't a smart man, but I can count the difference between a man who explains things to me and a woman who opened her books in a public hall." He sat down. The petition was withdrawn 20 minutes later. Nobody made a speech about it. A man named Halverson simply walked up the aisle, took the paper off the table, and tore it in half, and then a great many people started talking at once. Nathan Granger was arrested on the steps of the Grange Hall at Prosper Bend at 4:40 in the afternoon, and Sheriff Bowen did it quietly and without a hand on him, and Granger did not resist and did not protest and did not look at anybody in the crowd. He looked at Luke. 2 minutes, he said to Bowen. That's all I want. Bowen glanced at Luke. Luke nodded. They stood at the bottom of the steps with the whole county pretending not to watch. I want to know one thing, Granger said. The tooth. Was that luck? Half. Which half? The half where I got sent in that barn by a man who wanted to see me get hurt, Luke said. The rest was my father. He'd have found it in 10 minutes, and he'd have been kinder about it. Granger nodded slowly. I want you to understand something, and I don't expect it to do you any good. He said it without any performance in it at all, and that was somehow worse. I didn't start out to take a ranch. In '84, I was a clerk with a dead man's daughter to protect, and I moved $1,100 from one column to another to cover a shortfall that wasn't my doing, and I meant to put it back inside a year. And Wicks found it in '85, and after that, I wasn't the one deciding things anymore. 11 years. He almost smiled. You thought I was the top of it. I've been the one holding it up. There's men in Denver who never came within 400 miles of that valley, and they'll keep their coats clean, and I'll do the years. That's a sad story, Luke said. It's not a defense. No, Granger agreed. It isn't. I've had 11 years to walk into that office and say one true sentence, and I never did. And there's no version of that where I'm anything but what I am. He straightened his cuffs, and it was the last time Luke ever saw him do it. Your father was right, and I was wrong. Not about the water. About whether it had to be a matter of honor. He turned toward the wagon. It always does in the end. That's the part nobody tells you either. He was bound over in November, tried in the spring, and the judgment ran to 11 pages. Removal, restitution of $47,280, with interest against every asset he held, including his 100 shares of Meridian, cancellation of every instrument executed under the revoked power, and 4 years. Reuben Wicks surrendered the option. In a settlement, his own firm negotiated and then wrote a letter to the Denver papers describing his profound personal shock, which Ada Finch read out loud in the cookhouse to considerable effect. Harlan Voss sold the Cattlemen's Trust in February and moved to Oregon. Cordell Mabry got 3 years, Ort Bell got 11 months, and a wife who met him at the gate. The wire to the Stock Growers Association did what everybody said it would do. 2 buyers went elsewhere. A bank in Cheyenne called a note. Kensington Valley ran thin through the winter of '89 and let nobody go, and Eleanor sold 40 head of good geldings in January at a price that made Otis Pike sick to his stomach and made payroll every month. And by March, there were 4 operations in that territory writing to ask who her accountants were. Roof Dolan got his $2 in the first week of November. He got it in a yard full of people, because Eleanor said it had been withheld in a yard full of people, and that was where it was going back. And Roof stood there holding his hat and could not manage to say one word, and his wife Pearl said all of them for him. 61 families went into that winter knowing exactly what the man in the good coat had been doing with their September accounts, and knowing who found it. And there was not one person on that ground who called Luke Callahan a $100 cowboy ever again. He never asked for a thing. That was the part they talked about at the cookhouse table for years afterward, that he'd been offered a bonus at the settlement and had said no in front of Meacham and 2 lawyers, and when Eleanor pressed him on it in the office with the door shut, he'd said, "Ma'am, I owe you $110 and about 4 months. Let me finish it. If you pay me out of what he stole, then he's the reason I'm here, and I'd rather it was the horse." On a cold, bright afternoon at the end of that month, Luke rode the 11 miles home to a ranch that still had his father's name on the gate, and walked down to the dry creek with Toby beside him and Amos Teague coming slow behind, and stood at the bank where the well was. The survey stakes were gone. He'd pulled them himself in August and thrown them in a wagon bed, and nobody had ever come back to put them in again. "It's still running," Toby said. He was down on his knees with his sleeve pushed up, and his hand was in the water to the wrist. "Same as ever, cold enough to hurt." "Yeah. Don't seem like much." "No," Luke said. It never did. The debt came off in pieces through that winter, and Ada Finch kept the running total on the inside cover of a small green book she carried in her apron pocket, and every payday she would find Luke wherever he was and hold the book up and let him read it himself. $82, she said in December, standing in the doorway of the stallion barn with snow on her shoulders. "That's less than I figured." "That's because you figured wrong, which is the story of your arithmetic. You had a month's wage held in October when you were off on that mountain, and I've credited it. And Mr. Meacham looked at the account and said the estate had been getting the better of the arrangement since August, and that if he saw it in an audit, he'd flag it." She snapped the book shut. "So don't argue with me. Argue with St. Louis." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Callahan." She was already turning to go, which is how she said most of the things she meant. When it's clear, you'll want to think about what you're going to say. Because the day that number reaches nothing, somebody's going to ask you a question, and you have never once in your life been ready for a question. He didn't sleep well after that, and he was already not sleeping well. The valley ran thin. That was the plain truth of it, and anybody who tells the story with Kensington Valley sailing through that winter on the strength of being right has never made a payroll. The Cheyenne Bank called its note in November, and Eleanor paid it in full in 9 days by selling 40 geldings she had raised from foals. And Otis Pike stood at the loading chute while they went and would not talk to anybody for 2 days afterward. The hay contract with Halverson and Sons was rewritten at a fair price, which was a higher price because the old one had been a fiction with a man's commission buried in it. 2 buyers who had taken Kensington stock for 9 years went to Wyoming instead and were polite about it in letters. And every Friday, Eleanor Kensington sat down in the long office with Ada Finch and Otis Pike and Meacham's youngest man, a serious fellow of 26 named Boyce, who had been left behind to teach them a system and had stayed on because he liked the horses. And they went through the week's numbers out loud, and any man on that payroll who wanted to stand in the doorway and listen was welcome to. The first Friday, nobody came. The second, Roof Dolan came and stood in the door with his hat in his hands and understood about a third of it. By February, there were 11 or 12 men in that hallway every Friday, and the cook came, and 2 of the wives came, and a hand named Early Sipes, who had been on that ground since '79, asked a question about the freight rates that saved the estate $90 a month for the next 4 years. "That's the part I can't get over," Boyce said one evening, packing up. "In St. Louis, they hide the books from the men. Here they've got a fellow who can't read asking about drayage." "He can read a wagon," Pike said. "That's most of it." Pruitt was sentenced in Denver on a gray day in February, and Eleanor went, and Luke went with her because she asked him to and because he had spent 4 months trying to decide what he felt about the man and had not arrived anywhere. The court gave him 18 months, which was less than anybody expected, and the judge said in open court that the accounts of the Kensington Valley estate would not have been unraveled in 5 years without the trunks, and that the court took notice of it. Afterward, Pruitt stood in the hallway with a deputy at his elbow and could not seem to look up from the floor tiles. "Miss Kensington, I didn't expect you to come." "I know. I'd understand if you'd rather not speak to me." "Mr. Pruitt, I'm not here to forgive you." Eleanor's voice was steady and not unkind. "I've thought about it a great deal, and I don't think I'm entitled to. There were 61 families on that ground, and I only speak for one of them. What I came to say is that you'll be out in 18 months, and you'll be 34 years old with a good hand and a ruined name, and that is a long time to be nothing." He looked up then. "There's a stock association in Greeley wants a clerk," she said. "The man who runs it owes me a favor and knows exactly what you did, all of it, because I told him myself in a letter. He says the job's yours in 18 months if you want it, and he says you'll be watched like a hawk for 5 years. Pruitt's mouth worked. "Why?" "Because you put the pen down," Eleanor said. "You did it 9 days late, and you did it out of fear for your own neck, and it's the smallest decent thing I've ever been grateful for, and I've been grateful for it every single day since." She put out her hand and he shook it like a man taking hold of something hot. 18 months. Write to Mrs. Finch. She likes letters." In the buggy going back to the depot, Luke said, "You believe he'll take it?" "I believe he'll take it and be miserable and do the work well." Eleanor pulled her coat closed. "Do you disapprove?" "No." "You've got a face on." "Well, it's not that." Luke watched the wet street go by. "I keep thinking about my father. He'd have shook that man's hand too, and then he'd have gone home and been in a mood for a week, and Toby and me would have had to figure out why." "And?" "And I've been in that mood since October," Luke said. "That's all. I don't want to be a man who can't put a thing down. But I look at Pruitt, and I see a hand that wrote a date wrong, and that date is 8 days of my father's life." Eleanor was quiet for a mile. 8 days he'd have spent worrying," she said, "which is not nothing, and I won't insult you by saying it is. But it isn't 8 days of anything else. I know it. You'll put it down eventually." "How long did it take you?" "I'll tell you when I have," Eleanor said. The debt cleared on the 3rd Friday of March. Ada Finch held up the green book in the office doorway with 11 men standing in the hall behind her because she had, Luke realized later, arranged it that way on purpose. "Nothing," she said. That's the number. You're clear of this estate, Mr. Callahan, entirely and in full, and there's $4.60 owed the other way, which I'll put on your April wage if you stay and give you in coin if you don't. Somebody in the hallway said, "Well?" Luke stood there in a doorway with about 14 people looking at him and found out that Ada Finch had been right in December and that he was not ready for the question. "I'll take the 460 in April," he said. That was all he said, and the hallway made a noise, and Ruth Dolan hit him between the shoulder blades hard enough to knock his hat forward, and that was the whole of it. He did not talk to Eleanor Kensington about it. Not that day, not that week. He did not know how to open his mouth about it, and neither did she. And two people who had faced down a county in a public hall spent the entire spring being cowards about one sentence. The trouble came in April, and it came the way trouble usually does, which is dressed up as good news. Boyce laid it out on the long table on a Friday. With the ditch line dead and Meridian in receivership, there was still 9,000 acres of East Flat that would carry 3 times the stock it carried now if there were water on it. The survey was sound. The engineering was sound. The whole thing had been designed by men who intended to steal it, and it was still, considered strictly as a piece of work, the best idea anybody in that country had ever had. "It wants one thing," Boyce said. "It wants a head. 22 miles of ditch is nothing without a source, and there is exactly one live source on that flat." Every face at that table turned, slowly, toward Luke Callahan. He had known it was coming since November. He had thought about it lying awake and while shoeing horses, and once for 4 straight hours on a wagon seat, and he had not decided anything, and now there were 9 people looking at him and Eleanor Kensington at the head of the table with her hands in her pockets. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I'll make you an offer, and I want you to say no if you want to say no, and I want everybody at this table to hear me say that. All right? $9,000 for the section, cash, on any terms you like, and a perpetual right for your own ground to draw first off the head, written so that no drought and no court and no future owner of this estate can ever touch it." She paused. "That is more money than anyone in your family has seen in 3 generations, and it's less than the ground is worth to me, and I want you to know both of those things before you answer." The room was very still. "No," Luke said. Otis Pike closed his eyes. "Would you like to think about it?" "I've thought about it since November." Luke stood up because he could not say it sitting down. "Ma'am, I'll say the ugly thing first and then the rest of it. If I sell you that spring for $9,000, then every man in this territory who said, 'I got bought at Prosper Bend' was right, and he was only wrong about the price." He put both hands on the table. "And that's not even the main part. The main part is that it'd be the same thing." "The same as what?" "The same as him." He said it flat. "One outfit owns the water and everybody else on that flat asks permission. That's the whole plan he built. You'd just be a better owner than he'd have been." He looked around the table. "For a while. And then you'd die, ma'am, same as everybody, and it'd go to whoever it went to, and in 20 years there'd be a man in a good coat sitting at this table explaining the September accounts to somebody's grandchildren." Eleanor's chin came up. "That's a hard thing to say to me." "Yes, ma'am. After the year I've had." "Especially after the year you've had," Luke said. "You told 61 people in this yard that it wasn't your fault, it was ours, because everybody decided it was somebody else's business. Well, this is mine. I'd be a hypocrite to sit here." They looked at each other down the length of that table, and nobody else in the room moved a muscle. "Then what do you propose?" Eleanor said, and there was an edge on it. "Because I've got 9,000 acres of dry ground and a payroll, and no is not a plan, and you have been in enough rooms with enough books this winter to know better than to hand me a principle and walk out." "I know it. Then say the rest." "I want a ditch company," Luke said. "A real one. Shares held by the people who use the water and nobody else. 1 share to the acre, and no man and no company can hold more than 1/5 of it, no matter how much ground he's got. The head of the ditch deeds to the company, not to me and not to this estate. My section goes in as my share, and I don't take $1 for it. That's 12 owners arguing over a ditch." "That's 12 owners who can't be bought one at a time," Luke said. "He bought Voss for 80 shares. He bought Wicks with 160. He'd have bought this whole flat for the price of one man's signature, and he damn near did." He straightened up. "You want to know the only reason we caught him? Because Mrs. Finch kept a book he couldn't reach, and a deputy wrote down a shoe print, and Ruth Dolan drew 4 trails in the dirt with his finger. It was never one clever person. It was 6 ordinary ones who wrote things down. Ada Finch said quietly, "Hear him." "You'd be giving away a fortune," Eleanor said. "I'd be giving away a fortune I didn't earn," Luke said. "My father dug a well in a bad spot because he was stubborn. That's the whole of my claim to it, and I'd rather have a fifth of something that outlives me than all of a thing that gets sold the year I'm in the ground." Eleanor Kensington sat down slowly. "You realize," she said, "that this estate would go from owning the water to renting it in perpetuity, and my father would come up out of the dirt at Cheyenne to argue with me about it." "Yes, ma'am." "And that every neighbor I have would sit at a table as my equal on the one subject that matters in this country." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she laughed. Once, short, not a happy sound, more like a woman who has just seen the size of a bill. "All right," she said. "Ma'am," Pike started. "Otis, I have spent 13 years being told by everyone in this territory that a woman couldn't hold this ground, and I held it. And while I was busy holding it, a man walked out the back door with $47,000 because I was the only person allowed to know anything." She looked down the table. "I'm not doing that again. I'd rather own less of something that can't be robbed in the dark. Boyce, what does it cost to charter a mutual ditch company in this territory?" $22 and a lot of meetings." "Then that's what it costs," Eleanor said. "Write it up, and Mr. Callahan will sit at the table when the neighbors come, because it's his water and my money, and if either one of us is in that room alone, they'll be talking to the wrong person." That should have been the end of it, and it wasn't, because they had their real fight 3 weeks later, and it had nothing to do with ditches. It happened in the office with the door shut, and Ada Finch heard about a third of it through the wall and never repeated a word to anybody. It started over wages. Luke had been drawing $45 a month since August, and Eleanor put it to $65 in April, along with the title of stock manager under Pike, and Luke said no. "You are not going to make me chase you around this ranch about money for the rest of my life," Eleanor said. "It's too much. It is exactly the right amount. It's what the work is worth, and Otis wrote the figure, not me." "That's not the point." "Then say the point." She came around the desk. "Because I have been guessing at the point since March, and I'm tired. And I've had a year of being managed by a man who told me what to think, so I would be obliged if the next one would just tell me the thing." Luke stood there with his jaw working. "The point is that I don't know what I am here," he said. "I know what I do. I don't know what I am." He was too loud, and he pulled it back down. "Ma'am, in August I owed you money, and that was simple. And I could work 14 hours and eat cold supper and sleep in the aisle, and every man on this place knew exactly what I was. And then the debt cleared and I stayed, and I've got no name for it. And every time you hand me another $20 a month, the story gets easier to tell the wrong way, and I have got a 14-year-old brother, 15 now, who has to walk into that feed store at Prosper Bend for the next 40 years. So it's the talk." "It's not the talk. The talk I can take." "Then what?" And Luke Callahan, who had never once in his life found the soft way to say a hard thing, said, "It's that I don't want to be your hired man anymore, and I've got no earthly right to want anything else. And every dollar you hand me makes that worse, and I'd rather you paid me 30 than 65, because at 30 I could at least stand it." The room went very quiet. Eleanor Kensington sat down on the corner of her own desk. "Well," she said, "that's the point. That's the point. You could have led with that." "I've been told that before," Luke said. She put her hands in her pockets and then took them out again, which he had never seen her do. "I'm 39 years old," she said. "You're 28. I can count." "Then count the rest of it, because I've counted it 100 times and I'd like it said out loud once so it stops living in my head." She held up one finger. "You came into this valley owing me money in front of 200 witnesses. Half this territory has already decided what I bought, and they will never, ever stop saying it, and it will follow you into rooms you haven't walked into yet." Another finger. "In this territory, when a woman marries, everything she owns becomes a subject of argument in a courtroom full of men, and I have spent 13 years and the whole of my nerve keeping this ground out of the hands of men who thought they knew better, and 10 months ago I found out one of them had it anyway." Her voice was perfectly steady, and her eyes were not. "So you're asking me to hand over the thing I nearly lost, to a man I've known 9 months, in a country where the law will help him take it whether he wants to or not." "I'm not asking you." "You will be," Eleanor said. "Eventually. if you're any good at all. Luke stood there and had nothing. I'll tell you the worst part, she said. It isn't the ground. If it were only the ground, I'd have said yes in February and hang the consequences. It's that Nathan Granger sat in that chair for 11 years, and I never once checked him, because checking a man you trust feels like an insult, and I was raised to think that trusting people was the same as loving them. She looked up. It isn't. That's what I learned this year, and it cost me $47,000 and a friend, and I am not going to unlearn it for anybody. Not even for you, especially not for you. Then don't, Luke said. Don't what? Don't unlearn it. He came forward a step. Ma'am, what did we do in October when nobody knew who to believe? We wrote it down. Coyle wrote down a shoe print, and Stiles wrote down a hip, and Meacham wrote down 11 years. And the whole county changed its mind in one afternoon because somebody had put it on paper. He spread his hands. So put it on paper, whatever you want. Every acre, every horse, every dollar in that account stays yours and stays separate. And I sign it in front of a lawyer you pick and a lawyer I don't. And it gets filed at the county seat where anybody can walk in and read it. Eleanor stared at him. That's the least romantic sentence anybody has ever said to me. I know it. My mother would have fainted. Mine died when I was 9, and I don't remember what she'd have done, Luke said. But my father shot a horse for 11 days for your father and took his money and never once asked for more, and I'd rather be that than anything. Eleanor Kensington put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Get out of my office, she said. Come back Thursday. On Thursday, she handed him 11 pages. She had written them herself, in her own hand, over 3 nights, and there were 2 words crossed out on the 4th page and initialed in the margin. And Luke read the whole thing sitting on the office floor with his back against the wall because he could not sit still in a chair for it. Every acre of Kensington Valley, every head of registered stock, every account and instrument held separate and sole. A schedule of it all, 41 pages more, appended. A provision that, on her death, it went to a trust for the benefit of the estate's employees and their families before any spouse, with Otis Pike and Ada Finch and a bank in Denver as trustees. A provision that no instrument of that estate would ever again be executed under a general power by anyone for any reason. A provision, and this was the one that stopped him, that the books of the estate would be read aloud in a public meeting once a year, forever, to anyone who cared to walk in the door. And at the back, in a separate hand that was clearly Boyce's, a schedule of Luke Callahan's separate property. 1 section on the Prosper Bend Road with a house and a spring, 1 wagon, 1 saddle, $4.60. There's a thing missing, Luke said. There's not a thing missing. Boyce went through it twice. There's a horse missing. Eleanor did not look up from the desk. The stallion Blaze was purchased by this estate on the 12th of July for $100 and is estate property, and he is on page 19 of the schedule with the rest of the stud book. Page 19. Page 19. Ma'am, Luke said, look at me. She looked at him. He was never yours, she said. You know that and I know that. I bought $100 worth of a man's last argument with his father, and I have been ashamed of it since about 4 o'clock that same afternoon. She opened a drawer and took out a folded paper and put it on the desk. That's a bill of sale. 1 bay stallion, 5, 6 now. Years old, white blaze crooked at the bottom, sound. Consideration, $1. It's made out to Tobias Callahan, and it's dated the 12th of July, which is a lie I'm perfectly willing to sign, and I have been carrying it in that drawer since November waiting for you to be less stubborn, and you have gotten worse. Luke picked it up and could not read it for a moment. He won't take it, he said, not from you. He'll say it's charity and he'll be right, and he's 15 and he's got my whole disposition and none of my patience. Then don't give it to him, Eleanor said. Sell it to him. He's been working the yearlings for Otis since January at $1 a week, and he's got, by my count, $11 in a tin behind the tack room that he thinks nobody knows about. She almost smiled. Charge him $1. Let him hand it over. Let him carry the receipt in his hat for the rest of his life. Toby paid the $1 on a Sunday afternoon with about 30 people finding reasons to be in that yard, and he did it with his ears burning and his jaw set, and he counted it out in coins on the top rail of the fence the way a man pays a debt, and Ada Finch wrote the receipt and Otis Pike witnessed it. Then the boy walked into the pasture and stood there, and the bay stallion came across 200 yards of new spring grass and put his head over the boy's shoulder and breathed against his neck the way he had done every day of his life since he could stand. Toby Callahan put both arms around that horse's neck in front of 30 people and cried like he was 9 years old. Nobody in that valley ever said one word about it, then or after, and Ruth Dolan personally guaranteed that nobody ever would. They were married on the 14th of June, 1890, on the shoulder of the hill above the east flat where the ditch head was going in, because Eleanor said if they did it at the house, half the county would come and look at the furniture. It was not a fancy thing. There was no church and no music except a fiddle that a hand named Early Sipes played badly and with great feeling. The judge from the county seat came out and did the words and stayed for supper and ate more than any two men there. Eleanor wore gray and no jewelry except a plain watch pinned at the collar, which about 4 people noticed, and one of them was Ada Finch, who had to go stand behind a wagon for a minute. The marriage settlement had been filed at the county seat 11 days earlier. It was a matter of public record, and anybody could read it, and about 40 people did. And by the end of that summer, there were 2 other women in that territory whose lawyers had asked for a copy. Amos Teague gave the bride away, at her request, and to his complete astonishment, in a coat that had been his brother's and did not fit anywhere. He had a cabin of his own by then at the north end with a stove in it, and he drove the hay wagon in the season and told anybody who would sit still about a farrier in the Poudre Valley in '81. Toby Callahan stood up with his brother and lost the ring twice before the ceremony started and found it both times, and grew 4 inches that year, and would grow 3 more. Otis Pike wore a necktie. It was discussed for a decade, and afterward, when the tables were being cleared and the light was going long and gold across the flat, Eleanor found Luke standing off by himself at the edge of the hill, looking down at the line of stakes that ran 22 miles east. "You're hiding." "I'm looking." "At what?" "At all of it." He didn't turn around. "You know what I keep thinking about? Cyrus Pell." "Who?" "Hog farmer. He's the one that got dumped in the dirt at Prosper Bend about 40 minutes before you drove in." Luke put his hands in his pockets. "He offered me $18, and I've thought about it 100 times. If I'd taken that $18, I'd have been gone off that yard by 10:30. I'd never have been standing there when you came through the gate. Granger would have had the creek by Friday and the ditch by spring, and there'd be a company in Denver owning the water on this flat right now, and not one soul would ever have known a thing was wrong. That's a terrible thought. It's the true one, though." He turned around. "That's what I can't get past. It wasn't courage. There wasn't a single moment in the whole thing where I was brave. I said no to $18 because a horse put his head on my shoulder and I couldn't do it in front of him. That's all. That's the entire hinge of it." Eleanor stood beside him and looked out at the stakes. "I've had a version of that all winter," she said. "Mine's the tooth. $4. 11 years of theft, $115,000 of ground, 61 families. And the thing that opened the door was a fractured cheek tooth in a stallion that everybody had already agreed was a killer." She shook her head slowly. "Nobody looked in his mouth. That's it. That's the whole scandal. For 6 weeks, not one grown man in a valley full of horsemen looked in his mouth, because they all knew what he was. Everybody knew. Everybody knew, so nobody checked." She was quiet a moment. "That's what he lived on, you know, not cleverness." "I wasn't clever, Luke. I've read the audit 4 times, and there's nothing in it a bank clerk couldn't have caught. He lived on the fact that we all had somebody we'd decided not to check. I had him. Ada had him. Otis had him. The county had him. And he had 11 years. Down the hill, somebody was singing, badly, and being encouraged. "I'll tell you the thing that scares me," Eleanor said. "It's not that it happened. It's how ordinary it was on the way through. Nobody handed anybody a bag of money in the dark. He raised a manger 4 inches in March, and I signed the work order with 40 other things and went out to look at foals. That's how it goes. Not one big theft, 1,000 small, reasonable-sounding decisions that nobody had the standing or the energy or the nerve to ask about, and every single one of them looked fine at the time to somebody who was tired. And the fix is a public meeting once a year. The fix is a public meeting once a year and 12 people on a ditch board who can't stand each other," Eleanor said. "It's not much of a fix. It's slow, and it's dull, and half of it is Ruth Dolan arguing about headgates. But I'd rather be robbed by a committee than saved by one man, because when one man saves you, he's the one holding the key afterward, and I have already met that fellow." Luke laughed. "What?" "Nothing. It's just, that's the second time today somebody's told me the answer's boring. It is boring. That's why it works. Eleanor turned to face him. Nobody's ever going to write anything about what actually saved this valley. It was a woman keeping honest books when there was no reason to, and a deputy who wrote down what time it was, and an old brand inspector with one eye who came out on a Friday, and a clerk who put a pen down 9 days late, and a hand who couldn't read drawing 4 trails in the dirt with his finger. Not one of them did a brave thing. They did their own small work carefully in front of somebody who was willing to look at it. That's a hell of a wedding speech. You married a woman who runs meetings, Eleanor said. You knew. He took her hand and she let him, and they stood there. Can I say the last of it? Luke said. Go on. I spent a lot of that first month thinking I'd been saved. Everybody said it. Amos said it. Granger said it in a public hall with 300 people listening. Dan Callahan's boy got saved by a rich woman. He was looking east. And I got angry about it for months, and I finally worked out why. And it's not pride. It's that it's a lie about you. Luke, you didn't save anybody. You saw something. He said it slowly, because it had taken him a year. 200 people stood in that yard and looked at a horse and saw a killer, and you looked at the same horse and saw an animal somebody had taught to trust a hand. And the difference wasn't kindness, it was that you looked. Everybody else already knew. The sun was down behind the ridge, and the flat had gone blue, and the stakes ran out of sight. There's water in that ditch by August, Eleanor said. Boyce says. Boyce says a lot. He does. He's usually right, which is worse. She leaned against his shoulder, and down the hill somebody dropped a stack of tin plates and 11 people cheered. It did carry water by August, a thin, muddy, nervous flow the first week that a dozen grown men followed on foot the whole 22 miles like children walking a dog. The Prosper Bend Mutual Ditch Company held its first annual meeting in October in the Grange Hall with 14 shareholders present, and it took 5 hours, and 2 men nearly came to blows over a headgate, and Eleanor Kensington held 1/5 of the shares and 1 vote out of 14, and never once in her life tried to hold more. The books of the Kensington Valley estate were read aloud in that same hall every February for as long as anyone in this story was alive, and after that too. Attendance was poor in the good years. Luke Callahan never sold his father's section. He never got rich off the water and never tried to. And when men came out from Denver in the 90s offering serious money for a controlling interest in that ditch company, they went home empty every time because there was nothing to control. 1 share to the acre, no man above a 1/5. And it was all written down at the county seat where any fool could read it, which is exactly why nobody ever bothered to try after 1897. He and Eleanor had 2 children and lost one, and the one they kept was a girl named Ada who could read a brand at 40 yards by the time she was 7, and who eventually ran that valley for 31 years and was, by every account, harder to negotiate with than either of her parents. And the spring never quit. That's the part people always want to be a metaphor, and Luke Callahan would not have called it one, because he was not that kind of man. It was just a seep under a cut bank that a stubborn farrier dug a well on top of in 1886 because he trusted what he'd seen with his own eyes over what the whole county told him, and it ran cold and small and steady through 11 months of drought while everything above it cracked open, and it was still running when the men who called him a fool for digging there were 40 years in the ground. You could stand on that bank and look at it and see almost nothing. That was always the trouble with it. It didn't announce anything. It never once looked like enough. You had to get down on your knees and put your hand in it to know it was there.